Hi, my family. I included some of your lovely comments in this video and they really made me smile. The channel is going through a bit of a hard time, and I really need your support. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. If everyone watching likes, leaves a comment and subscribes, we can do it together. Thank you so much. Let's get started. The worst part of working in the Allegheny National Forest isn't the terrain, though it's not friendly. It isn't the cold, the long stretches of radio silence, or even the rare encounters with black bears. It's the silence. It settles in thick, crawling under your skin like something alive, something hungry. And when you've been out here as long as I have, you start hearing things that shouldn't be there. Whispers in the wind, footsteps that match your own until you stop walking, and then keep going for 3 more steps. It was 2003 and my name's Matt Vickers. I've been with Search and Rescue for about 11 years, working out of Warren County, Pennsylvania. 11 years of dragging bodies out of ravines, finding hikers who'd been picked clean by scavengers, and discovering campsites that looked like something had exploded from the inside out. I'm the guy they send when people go missing out here, which happens more than you'd think. The statistics don't lie. Allegheny swallows at least a dozen people every year, and we're lucky if we find half of them. Funny enough, I'm not really much of a camper myself, but you go where the work is. The outdoorsy types always expect me to say I'm passionate about the wilderness, that I feel some deep connection to nature's raw beauty. Truth is, I just prefer my paycheck to come with a decent health plan, but after 11 years of walking these twisted trails, I've learned to read the forest's moods. I can tell when the air pressure drops before a storm, when the animal sounds shift from normal chatter to the kind of desperate quiet that means something's hunting. That morning started like any other. With the phone ringing at 5:47 a.m., I answered on the second ring, already knowing what I'd hear. My supervisor's voice was tight with that particular strain that comes from dealing with worried families. "We got a call about a missing hiker," he said, skipping the pleasantries. A woman about 35 hadn't checked back in after her solo trip. Named Sarah Chen. She was supposed to return yesterday. I sat up in bed, already mentally calculating distances and search grids. Solo trips aren't uncommon out here. People come to escape their lives, clear their heads, find themselves or lose themselves depending on what they're running from. The problem is, nature doesn't care if you're looking for clarity or just want to disappear. It'll swallow you whole either way. And with Allegheny's dense forests and tricky paths that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them, I always wonder why anyone risks it alone. Then again, I've got a twisted sense of humor about these things. Half the time when someone vanishes, I figure they probably just got tired of their suburban life and decided to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe they're sipping on a mojito in Mexico while I'm trudging through the mud, following cold trails that lead nowhere but deeper into the woods. But Sarah Chen was different. Her sister had called it in, frantic, saying Sarah never missed check-ins. She was the responsible type, the kind who planned every detail of her trips and stuck to schedules like her life depended on it. That worried me more than if she'd been some reckless adventure seeker. When the careful ones go missing, it usually means something went very wrong. I met up with the volunteer crew around noon at the ranger station. The building sat like a lonely island in an ocean of green, its windows reflecting the forest canopy in a way that made it look like the trees were watching us from inside. Local guys, good folks, but they're more into the social aspect of the job. They want to be the hero, want to carry someone to safety and get their picture in the paper. They don't want to consider the fact that heroism out here usually involves hauling a body bag through 2 miles of undergrowth while trying not to think about what's left inside. We split into groups, and I got paired with one of the younger guys, Matt Lee. He was eager, probably mid-20s, with the kind of enthusiasm that made me feel ancient. First thing out of his mouth was a joke about how I should have retired by now. His laughter echoed off the trees in a way that made me uncomfortable. Sounds carry too far in these woods, and you never know what might hear them. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" he asked me as we checked our gear. His pack was too heavy, loaded with equipment he'd probably never use, but I didn't have the heart to tell him that most of what we carry is psychological comfort. When you're searching for someone who's been missing for 2 days, you're rarely looking for a rescue. "I already did," I said, looking out into the woods where the shadows seemed to move independently of the swaying branches. "That's why I'm still here." The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of towering hemlocks and ancient oaks that had been growing since before the first European settlers arrived. Between the trees, the understory was thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron, creating natural barriers that could hide a person, or a body, just feet from a main trail. The paths themselves were deceptive, seeming to fork and merge without any logical pattern, and I'd learned long ago that the forest had its own geography that didn't always match the maps. As we prepared to head out, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The birds were quiet. Not unusual by itself, but the quality of the silence was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a forest at rest. It was the held breath quiet of prey animals hiding from something that hunted them. Even the insects seemed muted, their usual buzzing reduced to an occasional anxious chirp. Matt Lee was bouncing on his toes, eager to get started, but I made us wait another 10 minutes. Listening to the forest's rhythm, that's when I heard it, a sound like branches breaking but rhythmic, deliberate. It came from deep in the woods, probably a mile or more away, but sound travels strangely in Allegheny. Sometimes you can hear a whisper from across a valley, and sometimes you can't hear someone screaming 50 feet away. "What are we waiting for?" Matt asked, and I realized I'd been standing motionless for several minutes just listening. "Nothing," I lied, shouldering my pack. "Let's go find her." But as we walked toward the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't going to find Sarah Chen. Something had found her first. We trekked along the South Branch Trail for hours, following the route Sarah Chen had marked on her itinerary. The air felt off, like it was sitting heavier than it should, pressing down on us with the weight of something unseen. The trail was well maintained but narrow, winding through stands of hemlock so dense that noon felt like twilight. Every few hundred yards we'd stop and call Sarah's name, our voices swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Matt was eager, taking point and cracking jokes to fill the silence, but I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. After 11 years in these woods, I'd learned to trust that itch at the back of my neck. Something was tracking us, staying just out of sight but close enough that I could feel its presence like a cold breath on my spine. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to change around us. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches reaching toward each other overhead like gnarled fingers trying to block out the sky. The undergrowth became thicker, more aggressive, with thorns that seemed to grab at our clothes and roots that appeared directly in our path. I'd hiked this trail dozens of times, but it felt different now, like the forest was deliberately trying to slow us down. "Hey, Vickers," Matt said, snapping me out of my thoughts. His voice was still light, but I could hear the first hints of unease creeping in. "You ever find someone out here that wasn't, all there when you found them?" I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean, all there?" Like missing pieces." He laughed, but it was nervous, the kind of laugh that people make when they're trying to convince themselves that everything's normal. "I heard stories about hikers they found with gaps. Once," I said, not elaborating. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. A hunter we'd found 3 years ago sitting peacefully against a tree as if he'd just stopped to rest. Except he'd been missing everything from the waist down, and the cuts were too clean, too precise for any animal I knew about. The official report had blamed scavengers, but I'd seen what bears and coyotes could do to a body. This was something else entirely. That shut Matt up, and we walked in silence for another hour. The trail began to slope upward, climbing toward a ridge that wasn't marked on any of our maps. The further we climbed, the more the forest seemed to press in around us, until we were walking single file through a green tunnel that muffled all sound except our own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. After another couple of hours, we stumbled across a clearing that definitely wasn't on any map. It was small, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and the trees around it looked wrong. They'd been growing at odd angles, reaching in different directions but not toward the sun. Some of them were bent nearly horizontal, as if something massive had pressed them down and held them there until they grew into those unnatural shapes. I've seen a lot of strange formations out here. Lightning strikes, disease, unusual soil conditions, but this one felt deliberate. Like the land itself was bending to avoid something. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 20 feet across, and the ground was bare earth instead of the thick carpet of leaves that covered the rest of the forest floor. "Looks like someone made a camp here," Matt said, crouching down by what appeared to be a fire pit. His voice echoed strangely in the clearing, bouncing off the twisted trees in a way that made it sound like multiple people were speaking. But the thing is, it wasn't a fire pit. Not really. The stones were too close together, stacked in a way that didn't make sense for containing a fire. They were arranged in a perfect circle, each one carefully placed and fitted against the others like pieces of a puzzle. And the ground inside the circle wasn't charred. It was dark, yes, but with a wetness that didn't look like ash. Yeah, I muttered, examining the stones more closely. Each one was smooth, worn as if by centuries of handling, and they were all the same size despite clearly coming from different parts of the forest. Someone tried to make it look that way. Matt was already poking around the perimeter of the clearing, and I could see his face shift from curiosity to something a little more serious. The enthusiasm was draining out of him like water from a punctured canteen, replaced by the kind of focused attention that comes when your body starts preparing for danger. "You got a light?" he asked, his voice suddenly quiet. I handed him my flashlight, and he shined it toward a small mound in the middle of the so-called camp. The beam caught something pale and artificial-looking among the dark earth. His face went pale as he focused the light more carefully. "Vickers, what the hell is that?" It took me a second to process what I was seeing. It was a foot. Not just any foot, but a woman's half buried in the dirt. The cut at the ankle was clean, precise, like someone had taken a bone saw to it. But what made my stomach turn wasn't the severed limb itself, it was how fresh it looked. The flesh was still pink, the nail polish still bright red despite being chipped at the edges. Whoever she was, she'd cared enough about appearances to paint her toenails before coming out here, before whatever had happened to her. The foot was positioned deliberately, toes pointing toward the center of the stone circle like an arrow. Around it the dirt had been patted down smooth. And I could see the faint impressions of other shapes in the earth. Shapes that might have been fingers, or claws, or something else entirely. Matt gagged and stumbled. The stone circle, the positioning of the foot, the careful staging of the scene. This wasn't random. Someone or something had wanted us to find this. The fire pit wasn't a campsite marker. It was a message, and the message was clear. We were in someone else's territory now, and they were letting us know that they were watching. I looked around the clearing again, seeing it with new eyes. The twisted trees weren't just growing strangely. They were positioned to create a natural amphitheater with the stone circle at its center. The bare ground wasn't just cleared of leaves. It was worn smooth by repeated use. This place had been used for something, and judging by the bone fragments scattered in the dirt, it had been used for a long time. "Who the hell would do that?" Matt asked, his voice trembling now. He was backing toward the edge of the clearing, his instincts telling him to get away from this place as quickly as possible. I didn't answer because I didn't know, but I'd been around long enough to know when something was off, and this was beyond off. This was a deliberate display, a way of marking territory and sending a message. The question was, what kind of creature left human feet as calling cards? The shadows in the clearing were growing longer as the afternoon wore on, and I realized with a chill that the sun was starting to set. We needed to get back to the main trail before dark, but first I had to call this in. The radio crackled with static when I tried to raise the base station, and it took several tries before I got through. "This is Vickers," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've got a situation here. Human remains, partial. Grid reference." I checked my GPS and read off the coordinates. "We're going to need the coroner and probably a forensics team." The response was garbled, but I caught the gist of it. Help was coming, but it would be morning before they could reach us. The unspoken rule in these woods is that you don't stay after sunset, especially not in a place like this. But as we prepared to leave, I took one more look at the stone circle and the severed foot. Something glinted in the fading light. Something I hadn't noticed before. Half buried in the dirt near the foot was a small piece of metal, a dog tag or piece of jewelry. I knelt down and brushed the earth away, revealing a silver bracelet with an inscription I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. That's when I heard it. A sound like branches breaking, but rhythmic, deliberate. The same sound I'd heard back at the ranger station, but much closer now. It was coming from the tree line just beyond the circle of twisted trees, and it was moving in our direction. Matt heard it too, his head snapping up like a deer sensing a predator. What was that? I slipped the bracelet into my pocket and stood up slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I forced myself to stay calm, to think rationally about what we were dealing with. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees. It was the kind of silence that comes just before something terrible happens. "We need to go," I said quietly, not wanting to raise my voice in the oppressive quiet. Now. But as we turned to leave the clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. Something was out there in the darkening forest, and it had been waiting for us to find its message. Now that we had, the real hunt was about to begin. We marked the spot with GPS coordinates and agreed to come back with more gear in the morning. Matt was still shaken up, his hands trembling as he tried to fold the map, and I couldn't blame him. First time seeing something like that tends to mess with your head. Makes you realize that the world is a lot more dangerous than you thought. But me? I was more concerned with the fact that someone had gone through the trouble of leaving a foot behind, knowing full well we'd find it. The hike back to the main trail should have taken us 45 minutes, but it felt like hours. The forest had changed around us, becoming more hostile with each step. Branches seemed to reach out deliberately to snag our clothes. Roots appeared directly in our path, and the undergrowth grew thicker and more aggressive. What had been a clear trail that morning was now a maze of obstacles that forced us to push through walls of thorns and climb over fallen logs that hadn't been there before. But worst of all was the sound that followed us. It wasn't the rhythmic breaking of branches anymore. It was something more subtle, more deliberate. Footsteps that almost matched our own rhythm, but not quite. When we stopped to rest, they continued for exactly 3 more steps before falling silent. When we started walking again, there would be a pause. Then the sound would resume, always staying just out of sync with our own movements. Matt heard it too, his head constantly turning toward the sound, his pace getting faster with each phantom footfall. "There's something out there," he whispered during one of our rest stops, his voice barely audible even in the oppressive quiet. I nodded, not trusting my own voice. The thing that was following us was smart enough to stay hidden, smart enough to maintain distance, smart enough to know that we knew it was there. It was toying with us, letting us know that we were being hunted but not revealing itself. The psychological effect was worse than any direct attack could have been. By the time we reached the main trail, the sun was setting, and the forest was transforming into something altogether more sinister. The familiar landmarks looked different in the fading light. Trees that had seemed welcoming that morning now loomed like twisted sentinels, and the trail itself seemed to shift and change with each step. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay and something else, something animal and wild. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about that clearing, about those trees and how unnatural they'd felt, like the woods themselves had recoiled from that place, bent and twisted to avoid something that didn't belong. I don't believe in ghosts or any of that nonsense, but there's something about Allegheny that goes beyond explanation. It eats people, plain and simple, and it's been doing it for a long time. I pulled out the bracelet I'd found and examined it under my desk lamp. The inscription was clearer now. Sarah, love always, Mom. My blood ran cold as I realized what this meant. The foot we'd found belonged to Sarah Chen, the woman we'd been searching for. But if her foot was in that clearing, arranged like some kind of offering, where was the rest of her? I spent the night researching, digging through old police reports and newspaper archives, looking for any pattern that might explain what we'd found. What I discovered made my skin crawl. Over the past 20 years, there had been dozens of disappearances in Allegheny, far more than the official statistics suggested. Hikers, campers, hunters, all vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only scattered belongings and sometimes body parts arranged in ways that didn't make sense. The reports were buried deep in the files, classified as animal attacks or accidental deaths, but reading between the lines, I could see the pattern. The missing people were always found in small clearings, always with evidence of ritualistic arrangement, always with key body parts missing, and in every case, the investigating officers mentioned hearing sounds in the forest, footsteps, breathing, the rhythmic breaking of branches. We went back at first light, bringing a couple more guys with us. I was leading this time, and I noticed something I hadn't before. There were no birds, not one sound. The forest was completely silent except for our own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Even the insects seemed to have abandoned this part of the woods, leaving behind an emptiness that felt almost alive. The other guys were nervous, picking up on the wrongness of the place even if they couldn't articulate what was bothering them. Their jokes fell flat, their voices echoing strangely in the oppressive quiet. We moved in single file, weapons ready, though I wasn't sure what good a knife or a service pistol would do against something that could cleanly sever a human foot. We reached the clearing again, but the foot was gone. Not dragged off by animals, gone. The dirt wasn't even disturbed, as if it had simply vanished into the earth. Matt looked at me with panic rising in his eyes, his face pale and sweaty despite the cool morning air. Vickers, we marked it right? We did mark it? I checked the GPS twice, verified the coordinates against my notes from the night before. No mistake. We were in the right place, but the mound, the stones, all of it had vanished. The clearing looked like it had been swept clean. The earth smooth and undisturbed. Even the bone fragments I'd seen scattered in the dirt were gone. That's when I knew we weren't alone out here. The thing that had been following us the day before was still watching, still toying with us. It had cleaned up its display, erased the evidence, but it was still here. I could feel its presence like a weight on my shoulders, a constant pressure that made it hard to breathe. Matt was losing it, rambling about how things like this didn't just happen, how there had to be a logical explanation. The other guys were confused, asking if we were in the right spot, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. I shut them down, knowing this wasn't a conversation to have out here. But I could feel it now, that crawling sensation under my skin that meant we were being watched, studied, evaluated. I signaled for us to spread out, search the surrounding area. I didn't expect to find anything, hell, I didn't want to, but protocol was protocol. We had to be thorough, had to check every possible hiding spot, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of these woods and never come back. Matt stuck close to me, still rattling off questions I didn't have answers to. His voice was getting higher, more desperate, and I could see the fear starting to take hold. That's when I heard it, a snap just beyond the tree line. It was faint, but enough to make me stop dead in my tracks. I motioned for Matt to be quiet and pointed toward the sound. It was getting closer, moving through the underbrush with the kind of careful stealth that spoke of intelligence and patience. Whatever was out there had been watching us, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I pulled out my knife, the only weapon I had on me. Stupid, I should have brought something better, something with more range. But the knife was sharp, and I knew how to use it. I'd gutted enough deer in my time to know where to cut to do the most damage. The sound was closer now, moving in a rough circle around our position. I could track its progress by the way the branches moved, by the subtle changes in the forest's ambient noise. It was big, whatever it was, and it was taking its time, studying us like a predator evaluating prey. Then I saw it. Standing just beyond the trees, barely visible in the dappled morning light, was a figure. Tall, easily 7 feet, with a hunched posture that made it seem even more imposing. Its limbs were too long for its body, thin but corded with muscle, and it was covered in patchy fur that looked more like coarse hair matted with dirt and something darker. It moved awkwardly, almost like it was learning how to walk, but there was a deliberate quality to its movements that suggested intelligence. It tilted its head as it watched us, the gesture almost human in its curiosity, and I got the distinct impression that it was studying us the same way we might study insects under a microscope. Its face was the worst part. It looked like someone had tried to mash a human and a wolf together but had failed miserably. The features were elongated, stretched, with too many teeth visible in what might have been a smile. Its eyes were dark, almost black, and they reflected the light in a way that made them seem to glow. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't human, but it wasn't just some animal either. It was something else, something that occupied the space between human and beast, something that had been shaped by the forest itself. Matt was behind me, his breathing hard and fast, but he hadn't seen it yet, hadn't looked in the right direction. I wanted to keep it that way, wanted to spare him the sight of the thing that was watching us with such obvious hunger. The creature shifted its weight, and I could see the muscles moving under its matted fur. It was preparing to move, to attack or to flee, and I had to make a decision. I could try to back away slowly, hope that it would lose interest and disappear back into the forest. Or I could face it, try to drive it off before it decided we were worth hunting. But before I could make that choice, it moved. Fast, faster than something that size should have been able to move. One moment it was standing at the edge of the clearing. The next it was bounding toward us with a fluid grace that spoke of years of hunting in these woods. I barely had time to shout a warning before it was on us, and I realized with horrible clarity that we had never been searching for Sarah Chen. We had been hunting, and now we were the prey. The creature slammed into me with a force I didn't expect from something so gangly. I hit the ground hard, my head bouncing off a root, and the world exploded into stars and darkness. The wind was knocked out of me, and my knife clattered away across the forest floor, useless now when I needed it most. I could hear Matt behind me, shouting my name, but it was muffled, like my brain couldn't quite process the sound. Everything seemed to be happening underwater, slow and distorted. The creature hovered over me, its breath hot and rancid, carrying the smell of rotting meat and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. Up close, I could see details that made my skin crawl. The patchy fur wasn't fur at all. It was coarse hair, slick with something dark and wet that might have been blood or saliva or something worse. The creature's skin underneath was pale, almost translucent, and I could see dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. Its fingers ended in claws that looked more like surgical instruments than natural weapons, sharp and curved and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. But it was the face that haunted me. Elongated, like someone had grabbed both ends of a human skull and pulled until the features stretched and distorted. The jaw was too long, filled with teeth that were too sharp and arranged in too many rows. Its eyes were completely black, reflecting my terrified face back at me like dark mirrors. The smell hit me in waves. Rot and decay and something animal and wild that spoke of years of killing and feeding. Whatever this thing was, it had been hunting for a long time, and it was very good at what it did. I kicked at it, scrambling to get away, but it was fast. Too fast. Its claw raked across my leg, and I felt the sharp sting of razors cutting through my pants into my flesh. The pain was immediate and intense, but it was nothing compared to the terror of seeing those black eyes studying me with such obvious hunger. Blood soaked through my pants, warm and sticky, and I could feel it pooling in my boot. The creature's head tilted as it watched the blood flow, and I swear I saw something like satisfaction in those dark eyes. It was enjoying this, drawing out the moment before the kill. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the pain, adrenaline kicking in as I rolled to the side and grabbed for my knife. My fingers closed around the handle just as the creature lunged again, and I swung wildly, more out of desperation than any real plan. The blade caught it across the arm, cutting through the matted hair and into the pale flesh beneath. The creature shrieked, not like an animal, but almost like a child in pain, high-pitched and wrong. The sound echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees and coming back to us from all directions. It backed off, surprised by the pain, dark blood dripping from the wound. But it wasn't retreating. It was reassessing, figuring out how dangerous I actually was. The intelligence in those black eyes was terrifying, more frightening than any mindless beast could have been. That gave me just enough time to get to my feet. Matt was there, pulling me up by the arm, his face pale as hell. His hands were shaking, but he was trying to help, trying to be useful in a situation that was beyond anything he'd trained for. "We have to go now," he yelled, his voice finally breaking through the haze in my head. "That thing, what the hell is it?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. But I could see the other guys in my peripheral vision, frozen in place, their faces showing the same mixture of terror and disbelief that I felt. This wasn't something that existed in the rational world they knew. It was something out of nightmare. Something that shouldn't be real. We ran, crashing through the brush like our lives depended on it. Because they did. Behind us, I could hear the thing moving, following us through the underbrush. It wasn't as fast as before. The wound I'd given it was slowing it down, but it wasn't stopping. It was persistent, patient, like a predator that knew its prey would tire eventually. The forest seemed to close in around us as we fled, branches grabbing at our clothes, roots trying to trip us with every step. The terrain became more treacherous, filled with hidden ravines and fallen logs that forced us to slow down, despite our desperate need for speed. We reached the rest of the group, and I could see the confusion on their faces as we burst out of the tree line, bloody and panicked. They hadn't seen what we'd seen, hadn't felt the primal terror of being hunted by something that was more intelligent than any animal had a right to be. One of the guys, Matt Bennett, stepped forward, trying to calm everyone down. He was older, more experienced, the kind of guy who'd been doing search and rescue for 20 years and thought he'd seen everything. "Vickers, what the hell is going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Before I could answer, the creature burst out of the trees behind us, moving with that same fluid grace I'd seen before. It crashed into Bennett like a freight train, and his scream cut through the air, sharp and short. He didn't have time to fight, didn't have time to run. Didn't have time to do anything but die. The creature's claws tore into his chest, pulling flesh and bone apart like it was nothing more than wet paper. Blood sprayed across the clearing, painting the trees and the ground an arterial red. Bennett's body convulsed once, twice, and then went still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the canopy above. The rest of us were frozen in place, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. This wasn't a bear attack, wasn't some rabid animal acting on instinct. This was deliberate, methodical, almost surgical in its precision. The creature knew exactly where to cut to cause maximum damage, exactly how much force to apply to tear through human flesh. I could hear Matt Lee swearing under his breath, his voice high and desperate. One of the other guys was praying, his words tumbling over each other in a stream of desperate pleading. But I wasn't praying or swearing. I was watching, studying, trying to understand what we were dealing with. The creature crouched over Bennett's body, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. It seemed to be listening, waiting for something, and I realized with a chill that it was waiting for us to run. This was a game to it, a hunt, and we were the prey. Something snapped inside me. I wasn't thinking anymore, wasn't calculating odds or considering consequences. I was acting on pure instinct, the same primal rage that had kept humans alive for millions of years. I grabbed a branch from the ground, a thick piece of oak that had fallen in some long-ago storm, and swung it as hard as I could at the creature's head. The impact was solid, meaty, and the creature staggered back, surprised by the sudden attack. Dark blood ran from a cut on its scalp, and for a moment it looked almost vulnerable. But then it recovered, and the look in those black eyes changed from hunger to something much worse. Anger. It growled, a sound that seemed to come from deep in its chest, vibrating through the air and into my bones. The sound was wrong, too deep, too guttural, like something that had been designed to inspire terror in human hearts. And then it did something I didn't expect. It smiled. The expression was horrible on that elongated face, stretching the features into something even more grotesque. Too many teeth, too wide, too knowing. It was the smile of a predator that had just realized its prey was more interesting than it had initially thought. For a moment, none of us moved. The creature and I stared at each other across Bennett's corpse. Predator and prey locked in a deadly standoff. I could feel the weight of its attention, the cold calculation behind those black eyes as it decided what to do next. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with the same fluid grace it had shown before. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving behind only the smell of blood and decay and the echo of that terrible smile. For a long moment, none of us moved. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that weighs heavy on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Matt was the first to break the silence, stumbling toward Bennett's body with tears streaming down his face. Oh God, what was that thing? What the hell was that? I didn't answer because I couldn't. I didn't have words for what we'd just witnessed, didn't have explanations that would make sense to anyone who hadn't seen it for themselves. All I knew was that something had been hunting in these woods for a very long time, and we had just become its latest prey. By the time the backup arrived, the creature was long gone. The cleanup crew found Bennett's body, or what was left of it, but they didn't find anything else. No tracks, no signs of the thing that had attacked us. No evidence that would help them understand what had happened. It was as if the forest had swallowed all trace of the encounter, leaving behind only blood and death and the memories that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The rest of the team was quiet, too shaken to process what we'd seen. They moved through the clearing like sleepwalkers, their faces blank with shock and disbelief. I could see them struggling to reconcile what they'd witnessed with their understanding of the world, trying to fit something impossible into the framework of their rational minds. When the authorities came asking questions, we gave them what they wanted to hear. Bear attack. It wasn't a great lie, but it was all we had, and no one was going to argue with that explanation. Not when there was a body to bury and families to notify and paperwork to fill out. The truth was too strange, too impossible, too dangerous to share with people who hadn't seen it for themselves. But I knew better. I'd seen the intelligence in those black eyes, the deliberate way it had moved, the surgical precision of its attack. This wasn't some rabid animal acting on instinct. It was something far more dangerous, something that had been shaped by years of hunting and killing in these woods. Matt Lee left the team a few days later. He couldn't handle it, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop seeing that elongated face in his dreams. He moved to Florida, as far from the Pennsylvania woods as he could get, and I never heard from him again. The others followed suit over the next year, finding excuses to transfer to different departments or retire early. No one talked about what had happened, at least not to anyone outside the unit. I stayed on. It's what I do. But the silence in the forest was different now. It wasn't just quiet, it was listening. The trees seemed to watch me when I walked the trails, their branches moving in patterns that had nothing to do with the wind. The shadows were deeper, more active, and I could feel something moving just beyond the edge of vision. The Allegheny woods don't forget. That much I'd learned. You can walk through them 100 times, but every now and then you'll feel it, that wrongness, that sense that something's watching you, studying you, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I found out later that there were stories, old ones, about something that lived in these woods. The locals don't talk about it much, but if you ask the right people, they'll tell you about the thing that's always been here, long before we came and cut down trees and built trails. They say it's a predator, something that feeds on human flesh and grows stronger with each kill. They don't have a name for it, though. Maybe it's better that way. Names give things power, make them real in ways that silence can't. But I know it's out there, somewhere in the green darkness between the trees, waiting for the next group of searchers to stumble into its territory. The missing person reports keep coming in, just like they always have. Hikers who don't return, campers who vanish in the middle of the night, hunters who are found days later with pieces missing. The official reports blame bears, accidents, exposure, anything but the truth, because the truth is too dangerous, too impossible for most people to accept. But I know what's really happening out there. I've seen it. Felt its claws rake across my flesh, looked into those black eyes and seen my own death reflected back at me. The thing in the woods is real and it's hungry. And it's been feeding for a very long time. Sometimes I think about leaving, packing up and finding work somewhere safer, somewhere that doesn't have shadows that move independently of their sources. But I've been here too long, know these woods too well. They're part of me now and I'm part of them, locked in a dance that started the moment I first set foot on these trails. Besides, someone has to know. Someone has to remember. Someone has to be here when the next group of searchers goes missing. When the next set of remains is found arranged in a clearing that doesn't appear on any map. Someone has to stand between the thing in the woods and the people who come here looking for peace, for solitude, for answers they'll never find. The radio crackles to life, interrupting my thoughts. Another missing person, another search mission. Another chance to walk into the green darkness and hope I come back out alive. I check my equipment, make sure my knife is sharp, and head for the door. Outside, the forest is waiting. It's always waiting, patient and hungry and full of secrets that mankind was never meant to know. The trees whisper my name as I walk past, their branches reaching out like fingers trying to pull me deeper into their embrace. I used to think I was the hunter, the one who tracked down the lost and the missing. But I know better now. In the Allegheny National Forest, there's only one true predator, and it's been hunting these woods for longer than human memory can recall. The silence settles in around me as I walk, thick and oppressive, crawling under my skin like something alive. And when I stop to listen, really listen, I can hear it out there in the darkness between the trees, breathing, waiting, watching. The hunt continues, just as it always has. And somewhere in the green depths of Allegheny, something is smiling with too many teeth, knowing that sooner or later, every searcher becomes the searched, every hunter becomes the hunted. The forest remembers everything, and it's still hungry. I wasn't really built for search and rescue. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm good at it. But I didn't wake up one day dreaming of saving lost hikers. Back in '97 when I started out, I figured I'd just be signing up to lead tourists through the forest of Montana. Maybe rescue a few campers who got too close to a bear. What I got instead was a never-ending loop of sleepless nights and missing persons reports. None of them prepared me for what went down in Butte County in 2003. I'm Carl, by the way. Carl Adams. Been doing this job longer than I care to admit. Most people think it's all about tracking footprints and following trails of broken branches. Yeah, that's the easy part. What they don't tell you about are the times when the missing folks don't come back in one piece. If they come back at all, the forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets have teeth. I was stationed in a remote stretch of forest outside Butte, near the Montana-Idaho border. It's dense wild country, the kind that swallows people whole if they're dumb enough to go wandering without a map or a clue. Ancient pines stretched up like cathedral spires, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the sun even at midday. The undergrowth was a maze of fallen logs, moss-covered rocks, and thorny bushes that could tear through denim like paper. Every shadow seemed to hide something, and the silence was so complete it felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That was my post. The last stop between clueless city slickers and the kind of wilderness that doesn't give second chances. I'd pulled maybe 30 bodies out of those woods over the years. Exposure, falls, heart attacks, the occasional bear mauling, but nothing that made my skin crawl the way it did that July morning when the radio crackled to life. It was early, July. The days had been quiet, and I was actually looking forward to a bit of a break when the call came in. The summer heat was oppressive, making the air thick and heavy with moisture. Even the animals seemed to be lying low, waiting for the temperature to drop. The forest felt different that morning, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the way the birds had gone quiet, or how the usual rustle of small creatures in the underbrush had stopped completely. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. "Carl, we've got a situation," came the dispatcher's voice, cutting through the silence like a blade. There was something in her tone that made my stomach clench. In 6 years of working with dispatch, I'd never heard that particular note of barely controlled panic in her voice. A group of 4 hikers, all college kids from Washington, hadn't returned to their campsite. Their friends were getting worried, said they hadn't heard from them in 48 hours. The missing group had been planning to explore the deeper trails, the ones that most tourists avoided because they were unmarked and dangerous. According to their friends, they'd been talking about finding some kind of authentic wilderness experience, away from the main paths. Normally, I'd chalk it up to kids partying, maybe getting lost or camping off trail. Hell, I'd found plenty of college groups holed up in caves or abandoned cabins, having the time of their lives while their friends back at camp worked themselves into a panic. But something about the tone of the dispatcher's voice made the hairs on my neck stand up. There was fear there, real fear, and dispatch didn't scare easily. "Carl, I need you to understand something," she continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "This isn't the first group we've lost contact with in that area. 3 weeks ago, we had a family of campers go missing for 2 days. When we found them, they were changed, traumatized. They kept talking about something watching them from the trees, something that wasn't quite right. We chalked it up to stress and exhaustion, but now..." The radio went quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing heavily on the other end. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but I could still hear the tremor underneath. "We were told to move fast, no delay. I'm sending Martin with you. Full gear, and Carl, be careful out there. Something feels wrong about this whole situation." By the time Martin arrived at the station, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. The shadows were growing longer, reaching out from the tree line like grasping fingers. Martin was a younger guy who'd joined the force a couple years back. He was still in that phase where he thought every case would turn out fine, like they'd just find the kids huddled by a campfire telling ghost stories. He didn't know better yet. His optimism was almost infectious, but it also made him reckless. He had a tendency to rush into situations without fully understanding the danger. "So what do we know about these kids?" Martin asked as we loaded our packs with emergency supplies, flares, and first aid equipment. His hands were steady, but I noticed the way he kept glancing toward the forest as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. 4 college students from Washington. Names are... I consulted my notes. Jennifer, Michael, Sarah, and David. All experienced hikers according to their friends. They were supposed to be back by yesterday evening. Martin nodded, checking his radio one more time. Probably just got turned around. These city kids think they know the wilderness, but they get out here and realize it's a whole different world. I wanted to agree with him, but something in my gut told me this was different. The forest felt wrong that evening, like it was watching us prepare. The air was too still, too quiet. Even the insects had gone silent, which was never a good sign. In my experience, when the forest went quiet, it was because something was coming. As we headed toward the trailhead, I caught myself looking back over my shoulder more than once. The feeling of being watched was almost overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the image of eyes peering out from between the trees. Not animal eyes, but something else. Something intelligent and patient and very, very hungry. By the time we got out there, it was nearly dusk. The light barely cut through the dense trees and the forest felt oppressive, like it was holding its breath. Every step we took seemed to echo in the unnatural silence, and I found myself moving more carefully, trying to minimize the sound of our passage. The trail the kids had taken wound deeper into the forest than most hikers ever ventured, past the safety markers and into territory that even experienced outdoorsmen avoided. The trees here were older, massive things that had been growing for centuries. Their trunks were so wide that 3 men holding hands couldn't wrap their arms around them. The canopy was so thick that even at midday, the light that filtered through was dim and green like being underwater. Now, with evening approaching, the forest was becoming a maze of shadows and half-seen shapes. My partner for the search was Martin, and I could tell he was starting to feel the oppressive atmosphere of the place. He'd gone quiet, his usual chatter replaced by tense silence. Every few minutes he'd stop and look around, as if he'd heard something moving in the undergrowth. But whenever I asked him about it, he'd just shake his head and keep walking. We started along the trail they were last spotted on, calling out their names, hoping for a response. Our voices seemed to be swallowed by the forest, disappearing into the thick air without even an echo. I'd done this routine too many times to count, but something about this felt different. Usually when you called out in the woods, you'd get some kind of response. Birds would take flight, small animals would rustle in the bushes, something would react to the sound of human voices. But here our calls seemed to vanish into a void of silence. Martin had this habit of talking to fill the silence. Something about how he once got lost as a kid and found his way back by following a stream. His voice was getting higher, more nervous, and I could tell he was starting to feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. The story he was telling didn't make much sense, jumping around from detail to detail without any coherent thread, but I let him ramble. Sometimes talking helped people deal with stress, and I could see the stress building in his shoulders, the way his grip on his flashlight was getting tighter. I didn't respond much to his chatter. The quiet out there was too heavy, like something was pressing down on us from all sides. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something else, something that was listening to our every word, watching our every move. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know when you were being hunted, and every instinct I had was screaming that we were no longer the hunters in this situation. The trail began to slope downward, leading us deeper into a ravine where the trees grew even thicker, and the shadows seemed to have a life of their own. Strange fungi grew on the tree trunks, glowing faintly in the darkness with an eerie phosphorescence. The air grew colder as we descended, and I could see our breath beginning to mist in the rapidly cooling air. An hour in, we found the first sign. A torn backpack near a rock face, not just dropped or abandoned, but ripped wide open. The fabric wasn't just torn, it was shredded, as if something with razor-sharp claws had systematically destroyed it. The contents were scattered across the ground. A water bottle cracked down the middle, a sleeping bag torn to ribbons, and food containers that had been crushed with such force that they'd been reduced to twisted metal and plastic fragments. But it was the smell that made my stomach turn. A sweet, cloying odor that reminded me of rotting meat mixed with something else, something I couldn't identify but that made my skin crawl. The smell seemed to cling to the fabric of the backpack, and when I leaned closer to examine it, the odor was so strong it made my eyes water. That's when Martin's chatter stopped. He looked at me, eyes wide with growing fear, but didn't say a word. The joking, optimistic young man I'd started the search with was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand that we were dealing with something far worse than a simple missing persons case. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, but I caught his wrist and shook my head. Whatever had done this might still be close, and the last thing we needed was to advertise our presence. We both knew something was wrong. The damage to the backpack wasn't consistent with any animal attack I'd ever seen. Bears might tear through fabric, but they did it to get to food, not with this kind of systematic destruction. Mountain lions were more precise, but they wouldn't waste time shredding equipment. This looked deliberate, purposeful, like something had taken pleasure in destroying the hikers' belongings. We pressed on slower now, weapons at the ready. You don't usually carry a gun for bears out here, but I'd learned to be prepared for anything. The forest seemed to be closing in around us, the trees growing closer together, the undergrowth becoming thicker and more treacherous. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. Every sound made us jump and spin around, fingers on triggers. I kept scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that we weren't alone. But it wasn't the kind of danger you could see coming. It was the feeling of being watched, of being stalked by something that knew these woods better than we ever could. You know that old saying, the trees have eyes? Well, it felt like that. Only the trees didn't need eyes. Whatever was out there had us in its sights, and it was patient enough to wait for the right moment to strike. The path began to wind through a series of steep switchbacks, taking us deeper into the ravine. The rock walls rose up on either side, covered in moss and strange formations that looked almost like faces in the dim light. Water dripped constantly from overhead, creating a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my heart. The sound echoed off the rock walls, creating an almost musical quality that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. As we descended, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. Scratches in the rock face, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws. But these weren't the scratches of any animal I knew. They were too deep, too regular, almost like they'd been carved deliberately, and they were fresh, the rock still showing white where the surface had been scraped away. Martin saw them too, and I watched his face go pale in the dim light. He opened his mouth to say something, but I held up a hand for silence. In the distance, I could hear something that made my skin crawl. It was a sound like breathing, but wrong somehow. Too deep, too rhythmic, like something much larger than a human was taking slow, deliberate breaths. We stood frozen, listening to that horrible sound echoing off the rock walls. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, and I couldn't tell if it was getting closer or farther away. All I knew was that whatever was making that sound was not something I wanted to meet in these narrow confines. 2 miles further in, the trail opened into a small clearing. The space was roughly circular, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to lean inward, creating a natural amphitheater. In the center of the clearing, the ground was bare dirt, packed hard as concrete. But it wasn't empty. Dark stains covered the earth, and the metallic smell of blood hung heavy in the air. That's where we found the first body. It was one of the hikers, a young guy no older than 22. His body was torn apart, limbs splayed out like a rag doll, but not by an animal. This was methodical, too precise, too deliberate. Pieces of him were missing, not torn away in the heat of an attack, but carefully removed as if someone had taken their time dissecting him. His torso had been opened from sternum to pelvis, the ribs spread apart like the pages of a book. The organs were gone, leaving only an empty cavity that seemed to stare up at us like a grotesque mouth. His face was the worst part. Let's just say I didn't need to check for a pulse. The expression frozen there was one of absolute terror, eyes wide and staring, mouth open in a silent scream. But it was what had been done to his features that made me want to vomit. Cuts, precise and surgical, had been made across his cheeks and forehead, creating a pattern that looked almost ritualistic. And his eyes had been removed with such care that the sockets were perfectly clean, like they'd been scooped out with a spoon. Martin gagged, turning away and retching into the bushes. I wanted to crack a joke about weak stomachs, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. This wasn't the kind of thing you laugh off. This was the kind of thing that stayed with you, that crept into your dreams and made you question everything you thought you knew about the world. The smell was overwhelming, a combination of blood, decay, and something else. Something sweet and sickly that made my stomach churn. Flies buzzed around the body in thick clouds, and I could see maggots already beginning their work. But what disturbed me most was the arrangement of the body. It wasn't just dumped here. It was displayed, positioned carefully as if to create maximum impact on whoever found it. We radioed back to base, our voices shaking as we reported the casualty. The dispatcher's voice was tight with stress when she responded, telling us to stay put and wait for backup. But staying put wasn't an option. Not when there were 3 more kids out there, possibly still alive, possibly suffering the same fate as their friend. The forest around the clearing seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The trees swayed despite the absence of wind, their branches creating a susurrus of whispers that seemed to carry words just beyond the edge of comprehension. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, certain that something was watching us from the tree line. We kept moving, faster now, driven by a combination of duty and the desperate need to get away from that clearing. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I'd been on enough hunts to know when something wasn't right, and this whole situation stank of it. The forest felt alive around us, not in the normal way of wind and wildlife, but in a way that suggested intelligence, purpose, hunger. We found the second body maybe 100 yards further along the trail. A girl this time, probably around 20 years old. She was broken, like someone had twisted her limbs at impossible angles before snapping them like twigs. Her left arm was bent backward at the elbow, the bone protruding through the skin in a jagged white spike. Her legs were twisted underneath her body, knees pointing in directions that made my own joints ache in sympathy. She was wearing a bright red hiking shirt that was now stained almost black with blood. The fabric had been torn away in places, revealing deep claw marks across her chest and abdomen, but these weren't random wounds. They formed a pattern, almost like letters in some unknown alphabet, carved into her flesh with surgical precision. Her eyes were open, frozen in an expression of pure terror that seemed to follow us as we moved around the body. And again, parts of her were just missing. Her right hand was gone, severed at the wrist with what looked like a clean cut. Chunks of flesh had been removed from her thighs and shoulders, the wounds showing signs of being gnawed on, as if something had been feeding on her while she was still alive. The positioning of this body was even more deliberate than the first. She'd been arranged in a specific pose, arms outstretched as if she were reaching for something or perhaps trying to ward something off. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and I could see that her tongue had been cut out, leaving behind only a dark, bloody cavity. Martin stopped in his tracks, his face pale as paper. "What the hell could do this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the oppressive silence of the forest. I didn't answer, mostly because I didn't know. My mind raced through the possibilities. Mountain lions, wolves, bears, some unholy combination of predators. But nothing fit. The wounds were too precise, too deliberate. The arrangement of the bodies was too purposeful. This wasn't the work of animals acting on instinct. This was the work of something with intelligence, something that took pleasure in inflicting pain and terror. Not with this kind of violence. This wasn't an animal attack. Animals killed for food, for territory, for self-defense. They didn't torture. They didn't arrange their kills for maximum psychological impact. They certainly didn't remove specific body parts with surgical precision while leaving others untouched. The smell here was even worse than at the first sight. The sweet, cloying odor of decay was mixed with something else, something that reminded me of sulfur and burnt meat. It clung to the inside of my nostrils, making every breath a struggle. The flies were thicker here too, forming clouds so dense they obscured parts of the body from view. We should have turned back right then. Should have radioed for a full tactical team and gotten the hell out of those woods. But we didn't. Maybe it was the thought that someone was still alive out there, that we might be able to save at least one of the remaining hikers. Or maybe it was stupidity, plain and simple. Maybe it was the way the forest seemed to be herding us forward, making retreat feel impossible. Whatever the reason, we pressed on, and the forest seemed to close in tighter around us with every step. The path became narrower, more treacherous, forcing us to walk single file through passages barely wide enough for a man. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches catching at our clothes and equipment as if trying to hold us back, or maybe trying to slow us down for whatever was following us. The third body was the worst. We found it about 20 minutes later, in a small grove where the trees formed a natural circle. This one was hanging from a tree, strung up like a warning, like a scarecrow designed to terrorize rather than protect. The rope around his neck was made from what looked like braided human hair, and his body spun slowly in the still air, creating a hypnotic, horrible dance. His body was mutilated in ways that defied description. The skin had been peeled away in strips, leaving behind raw, bloody flesh that glistened in the dim light. His fingers and toes had been removed, leaving behind stumps that ended in bone and gristle. His chest had been opened and his ribs spread apart. But unlike the first victim, his organs had been arranged around the base of the tree in a careful pattern, as if they were some kind of offering. I'll spare you the details of what had been done to his face, but let's just say it wasn't quick. Someone had taken their time, had savored every moment of his suffering. The expression of agony that was carved into what remained of his features was so intense, it seemed to radiate pain even in death. Someone. That was the first moment I truly realized we weren't dealing with an animal. No bear, no mountain lion, no wolf could have done this. This was the work of something with hands, something with intelligence, something that understood the concept of torture and took pleasure in it, something that knew how to make death last. how to extract maximum suffering from its victims. The arrangement of the organs around the tree suggested ritual, purpose, intelligence. They weren't just scattered randomly, they were placed in a specific pattern that spoke of meaning, of intention. It was as if whatever had done this was trying to communicate something, to send a message to whoever found the body. Martin lost it then, started hyperventilating and mumbling about getting out, about calling for backup, about how this wasn't what he'd signed up for. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his radio, and I could see the panic building in his eyes. He was coming apart at the seams, and I knew I had to hold it together for both of us, but deep down I knew he was right. We were in over our heads, way over our heads. Whatever had done this wasn't going to let us walk out of those woods. Not now. We'd seen too much, knew too much. We were witnesses to something that was meant to remain hidden, and I had the growing certainty that we were being allowed to see these horrors for a reason. The forest around us seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and I could feel something watching us from the shadows. Not just watching, but studying us, learning our weaknesses, our fears. It was patient, this thing, willing to let us discover its handiwork at our own pace. It wanted us to understand what we were dealing with, wanted us to be afraid. And it was working. I was more afraid than I'd ever been in my life. Then we heard it. The snapping of branches, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from deeper in the trees. At first I thought it might be another hiker, one of the missing kids maybe, but the sound wasn't right. Too heavy, too deliberate, too rhythmic. These weren't the panicked steps of someone lost and frightened. These were the measured strides of something that knew exactly where it was going. The footsteps seemed to circle us, moving through the forest with an ease that spoke of intimate familiarity with the terrain. Whatever was making those sounds could navigate the dense undergrowth without difficulty, could move through spaces that would challenge even an experienced woodsman. And there was something else about the sound, something that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of something large trying to move quietly and failing just enough to let us know it was there. I raised my rifle, motioned for Martin to stay close. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands were slick with sweat despite the cool air. Martin was breathing in short, panicked gasps, and I could smell the fear coming off him in waves. For a second I wondered if this was it, if this was how it would end. 2 search and rescue workers becoming the very thing they'd been looking for. 2 more bodies to add to the growing collection. The footsteps stopped. The forest went completely silent, so quiet I could hear my own pulse beating in my ears. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if they knew something was about to happen. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable in its intensity. Every second felt like an hour, every heartbeat like a drum announcing our presence to whatever was out there. And then it stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't human, not entirely. But it wasn't animal either. I'd seen wild animals before, had encountered bears and mountain lions and wolves in my years of search and rescue. But this thing, this abomination, was something else entirely. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its frame both massive and eerily graceful. Its body was covered in a patchwork of fur and skin, but not its own skin. Human skin, pieces of it stitched together with what looked like sinew and wire, creating a grotesque tapestry of flesh that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. The patches of human skin were in different stages of decay, some fresh and pink, others gray and mottled with death. I could see tattoos on some of the pieces, a butterfly on what had once been someone's shoulder, initials carved into what might have been a forearm. The stitching was crude but effective, creating seams that wept a dark fluid that stained the creature's fur. Its face was the worst part. Elongated like a wolf's, but wrong in ways that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. The snout was too long, too narrow, filled with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. But the eyes were almost human, showing an intelligence that was both familiar and utterly alien. They were pale blue, almost white, and they seemed to look right through me, reading my thoughts, my fears, my memories. The creature's arms were longer than they should have been, ending in hands that were part human, part claw. The fingers were elongated and tipped with curved talons that looked like they could tear through steel. Its legs were jointed wrong, bending in places that shouldn't bend, giving it a gait that was both fluid and disturbing to watch. It didn't move like an animal. Animals moved with purpose, with instinct, with the simple goal of survival. This thing moved like it had consciousness, like it was thinking, planning, enjoying the fear it was creating. It tilted its head to one side, studying us with those horrible pale eyes. And I swear I saw it smile, revealing rows of teeth that gleamed like ivory knives. Martin screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed off the trees and seemed to hang in the air long after his voice had stopped. The creature's smile widened at the sound, and it made a noise that was part growl, part laugh, part something I couldn't identify but that made my blood freeze in my veins. I fired without hesitation, the rifle bucking in my hands as the bullet tore through the air. The shot was perfect, center mass, the kind of shot that would drop a bear or a mountain lion instantly. But the thing didn't even flinch. The bullet seemed to pass right through it, or maybe it struck something that was harder than flesh, harder than bone. The creature looked down at where the bullet had struck, then back at me, and that horrible smile grew even wider. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, faster than physics should have allowed. One moment it was 20 feet away, the next it was right in front of us, closing the distance in a blur of motion that my eyes couldn't follow. The smell hit me like a physical blow, a combination of rotting meat, wet fur, and something else, something that smelled like fear and death and hopelessness. I grabbed Martin, pulling him to the ground as the creature's claws swiped at the air above our heads. The talons passed so close I could feel the wind from their passage, and I heard the whistle of air being cut by something impossibly sharp. If I'd been a second slower, if I'd hesitated even for a moment, those claws would have taken our heads clean off. We scrambled, half running, half crawling through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin as we fought to get away. Behind us, the creature's footsteps pounded against the forest floor, each step sending vibrations through the ground that I could feel in my bones. It was toying with us, I realized, letting us get just far enough ahead to think we had a chance before closing the distance again. The forest became a blur of green and brown as we crashed through the undergrowth. Thorns tore at our clothing, roots caught our feet, and low-hanging branches whipped across our faces. But we didn't stop, couldn't stop. The sound of the creature behind us was constant now, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to match the beating of my heart. I could hear it breathing, great gasping breaths that sounded like a bellows working, and I could hear something else, something that made my soul cringe with terror. It was laughing. A sound like wind through dead leaves mixed with the death rattle of something dying. It was enjoying this, taking pleasure in our fear, our desperation, our helplessness. Martin stumbled, going down hard on his knees and hands. I grabbed him, hauling him to his feet as the creature's shadow fell across us. I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on my shoulders, could smell its breath hot and fetid on the back of my neck. For a moment I thought we were finished, that this was where our story would end. But then I saw it, a gap in the trees ahead, a break in the canopy that let in actual sunlight, the tree line, the end of the forest, salvation. I pushed Martin ahead of me, using my body to shield him from the creature behind us. We burst through the undergrowth like men possessed, driven by the primal need to reach the light, to escape the darkness that had swallowed us. I don't know how we made it out of there. Adrenaline, maybe. Fear, definitely. Pure blind luck probably played a part. But somehow we managed to crash through the tree line and into the open, stumbling and falling onto the blessed sun-warmed grass of the clearing where we'd left our vehicles. We were met by backup. 2 trucks full of guys who didn't know what the hell they were walking into. They saw us stumbling out of the forest, torn and bloodied, eyes wide with terror, and I watched their expressions change from concern to confusion to growing alarm. These were experienced men who'd seen their share of trauma and tragedy, but they'd never seen anything like what we'd just experienced. I tried to explain what we'd encountered, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you describe something that shouldn't exist? Something that violates every natural law you've ever known? How do you tell someone that there's a monster in the woods? Something that wears human skin like a trophy and treats murder like an art form? The words came out in fragments, disconnected pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense even to me. I told them about the bodies, about the systematic mutilation, about the thing that had chased us through the forest, but I could see in their eyes that they thought I was in shock, that the trauma of finding the bodies had caused me to hallucinate, to create a monster where there was only a very human killer. Martin was useless, shaking and muttering to himself, his eyes darting constantly toward the tree line, as if expecting the creature to burst out of the forest at any moment. He kept repeating fragments of what he'd seen, descriptions of the creature that sounded like the ravings of a madman. The other officers looked at him with pity, with the kind of compassion you'd show someone who'd snapped under pressure. They took us back to base, but I didn't sleep that night or the night after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing's face, those pale eyes studying me with inhuman intelligence. I could smell its stench, could hear its laughter echoing in my dreams. The rational part of my mind tried to convince me that it had been some kind of hallucination, that the stress of finding the bodies had caused me to see things that weren't there, but I knew better. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. The official search team went back the next day, a heavily armed tactical unit that was prepared for anything except what they found. Or rather, what they didn't find. The creature was gone, vanished as if it had never existed, but the bodies were still there, still arranged in their grotesque displays, still bearing the evidence of systematic torture and mutilation. They found the fourth hiker that day, or what was left of her. She was discovered in a small cave about a mile from where we'd encountered the creature. Like the others, she'd been tortured before being killed, her body bearing the same precise cuts and deliberate mutilations. But there was something different about her death, something that suggested she'd lived longer than the others, that her suffering had been prolonged and intensified. The medical examiner's report was clinical and precise, describing the wounds and the manner of death with scientific detachment. But I could read between the lines, could see the horror that the medical team had tried to hide behind professional language. The things that had been done to that girl were beyond comprehension, beyond the capacity of any human mind to inflict. All 4 bodies were recovered and returned to their families. The official report classified the deaths as the result of a wild animal attack, possibly a rogue bear or mountain lion. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but it was the only explanation that made sense to minds that weren't prepared to accept the existence of something like what we'd encountered. But anyone who was out there, anyone who saw what we saw, knows the truth. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. It was something else. Something that had been hiding in those woods for God knows how long. Something that had learned to hunt human beings for sport. The investigation was closed within a week, the case files sealed and forgotten. Martin took early retirement, moving to a small town in Florida where he could be close to the ocean and far from any forests. He sends me a Christmas card every year, but we never talk about what happened. Some things are too big for words, too terrible for conversation. I stayed on the job for another 3 years, but I was never the same. The forest had changed for me, had become a place of shadows and hidden threats. Every missing person case filled me with dread. Every search and rescue operation made me wonder if I was walking into another encounter with something that shouldn't exist. We never went back to that part of the forest. Not officially, at least. The area was quietly closed to public access, cordoned off with bureaucratic red tape and environmental concerns. But the real reason was simpler. Nobody wanted to risk another encounter with whatever was living in those woods. The nightmares started about a month after the incident. I'd dream of walking through the forest, following a trail that seemed familiar but was always subtly wrong. The trees would be too tall, the shadows too deep, the silence too complete, and always at the end of the trail I'd find that thing waiting for me, those pale eyes studying me with patient hunger. In the dreams I could never run, never escape. I was forced to stand there and watch as it approached, to smell its stench, to see the patches of human skin that covered its body. It would reach out with those impossible hands, those elongated fingers tipped with claws, and just before it touched me, I'd wake up screaming. The dreams became so frequent, so vivid that I started taking sleeping pills, then drinking, then both. Nothing helped. The creature had taken up residence in my subconscious, a permanent reminder of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. I began to understand that surviving the encounter was only the beginning of the horror, that the real torment was having to live with the knowledge that such things existed. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the trees and the darkness seems particularly thick, I think about that thing still out there, still watching, still waiting. I wonder if it remembers us, if it's patient enough to wait for us to return. I wonder if it's found other victims, other hikers who wandered too far off the beaten path and discovered that some trails lead to places where human beings were never meant to go. And maybe, just maybe, it's still hungry. Maybe it's learned to be more careful, more selective in its hunting. Maybe it's moved to other forests, other wilderness areas where people go to escape civilization and end up finding something far worse than anything they were running from. The official records will tell you that 4 college students died in an animal attack in the summer of 2003. But I know better. I know that there are things in this world that don't belong in any official report. Things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we're afraid to know. And I know that sometimes when you go looking for missing people, you find more than you bargained for. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of those secrets have teeth. Some of them wear human skin like a badge of honor, and some of them are still out there, waiting for the next group of hikers to wander too far from the safety of civilization and into the darkness where monsters are real and nightmares come to life. I never went back to those woods. I never wanted to, but sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I can feel those pale eyes watching me, can smell that terrible stench on the wind, and I know that somewhere out there, in the deep places where the sun never shines and the shadows never lift, it's waiting for me to come back, waiting to finish what it started, waiting to add my skin to its collection. I was driving north from Belforge, South Dakota, aiming to meet a friend near Ekalaka, Montana. A simple route, nothing too complicated, just miles of two-lane highway and fields dotted with grazing cattle. The afternoon sun had been merciless, beating down on the asphalt until it shimmered like water, and my air conditioning struggled against the oppressive heat that seemed to seep through the very metal of my car. I'm not even sure where to begin because it feels like an odd fever dream stitched together from too many late-night documentaries. But I swear, every moment of this happened, every grotesque detail, every moment of terror that followed. It all unfolded exactly as I'm about to tell you. The landscape had been gradually changing as I drove deeper into Montana. The rolling hills of South Dakota gave way to something more austere, more desolate. Endless stretches of prairie grass swayed in the wind like a golden sea, interrupted only by the occasional weathered barn or cluster of cattle that watched my passage with blank, unblinking eyes. There was something unsettling about their stare, as if they were witnesses to secrets buried in this vast emptiness. I reached the Montana border right after sunset, which in hindsight was my first mistake. I should have arrived before dark. The sky had transformed into a canvas of deep purples and oranges, beautiful but somehow ominous. As the last light faded, the landscape took on an alien quality. The familiar became strange, and what had seemed like peaceful farmland now felt like a vast, unknowable wilderness. The temperature dropped dramatically once the sun disappeared, and I found myself turning on the heater despite the day's scorching heat. The sudden cold felt unnatural, almost aggressive, as if the land itself was rejecting my presence. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, revealing nothing but the endless ribbon of asphalt and the occasional reflective eyes of some creature watching from the roadside. I stopped briefly in Alzada, a tiny, unincorporated place that's basically a curve in the road with a bar, a post office, and not much else. The few streetlights cast sickly yellow pools of illumination that seemed to emphasize the darkness rather than dispel it. I'd planned to top off my tank, but the one pump looked out of order. Not just broken, but deliberately sabotaged. The hoses had been cut, and there were scratch marks on the metal casing that looked almost like claw marks. A local fell on a porch across the way, gave me a glance like he'd seen enough strangers for a lifetime. His face was gaunt, deeply lined, and his eyes held a wariness that went beyond simple unfriendliness. He was rocking slowly in an old wooden chair, the creaking audible even from where I stood. When I raised my hand in greeting, he stopped rocking entirely and just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I had half a tank left, so I figured I'd push on rather than approach him for directions or information. As I walked back to my car, I noticed that every window in the small cluster of buildings was dark except for one. In the post office, a single light burned behind dirty glass, and I could swear I saw the silhouette of someone standing perfectly still, watching me. The figure didn't move the entire time I was in view, and when I glanced back from my car, it was gone, but the light remained burning. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of something I couldn't identify, something organic and unpleasant like meat left too long in the sun. It made my stomach turn, and I rolled up my windows quickly, eager to get back on the road and away from this place that felt more like a movie set than a real town. I got back on Highway 323, expecting it to be empty for the next hour or so. The night sky was incredible, an unbelievable spread of stars, the kind that make you feel a little small. But there was something oppressive about that vastness, as if the universe was pressing down on me, reminding me how insignificant I was in this endless expanse of darkness. The road stretched ahead like a black river, and my headlights seemed pitifully inadequate against the overwhelming darkness. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to dart across the road just beyond the reach of my lights. I told myself it was just jackrabbits or coyotes, but the movements were too fluid, too deliberate. A while later, around 9:30 or so, I spotted a side road that wasn't on my map, just a dirt track cutting off into the darkness. Sometimes I get curious, especially out in big sky country. The opening was marked by two weathered fence posts, one tilted at an odd angle, as if something had struck it with tremendous force. Hanging from the upright post was what looked like a piece of cloth, but as I slowed down, I realized it was something else entirely, a strip of what appeared to be animal hide, dried and blackened with age. I thought maybe it was a scenic overlook or a ranch road that would let me see a different angle of the horizon. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to keep driving, to stick to the main road, but something pulled me toward that dark opening. It was as if the road itself was calling to me, promising answers to questions I didn't even know I had. So I slowed down, turned in, and the moment my tires hit that gravel, it felt like crossing an invisible line. The temperature inside my car dropped several degrees and my breath began to fog. The radio, which had been playing static-filled country music, suddenly went silent. When I tried to adjust the dial, all I got was a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the car's frame. I drove for about 10 minutes, not really seeing much except silhouettes of distant buttes and the outline of old fence lines. The road was rougher than I'd expected, full of potholes and washouts that made my car bounce and rattle. But it was the silence that got to me most. Not the peaceful quiet of a rural night, but a dead, oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even the sound of my own engine. The fence lines I passed were strange, constructed not just of wire and posts, but adorned with what looked like bones, bleached white skulls of cattle and smaller animals tied to the posts with leather cords. At first, I thought it might be some kind of rustic decoration, but as I passed more of them, I realized they were arranged in patterns, almost like some kind of coded message. Then I noticed a flicker of light, just a tiny glow, like a lantern or a campfire off to my left. It was perhaps a quarter-mile away, nestled in a small depression between two low hills. The light seemed to pulse rhythmically like a heartbeat, and occasionally it would flare brighter before dimming again. I pulled over, shut off my engine, and tried to figure out what I was looking at. The silence was complete now, so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The light was faint, but it moved a bit, like people were carrying it around. I was debating heading back to the main road when I heard voices, low, hushed, but definitely more than one person. The voices rose and fell in a pattern that wasn't quite speech and wasn't quite singing, something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was an urgency to the sounds, as if whatever was happening was building towards something significant. I couldn't make out the words if they were words at all, but the tone was unmistakably ritualistic. Maybe it was just a group of ranchers or campers, though it was a strange spot for a camp. The depression where the light flickered was clearly visible now, and I could see it was perfectly circular, as if it had been carved out of the landscape by some massive tool. The walls of the depression were too smooth, too regular to be natural. But there was something unnerving about the way the light danced, bobbing slightly, as if whoever was holding it was pacing in a tight circle. My gut told me to leave, but my curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my flashlight and walked maybe 50 yards closer, half crouching behind some scraggly sagebrush. The wind was picking up, swirling dust around my ankles and carrying with it that same nauseating smell I'd noticed in Alzada, but stronger now, more concentrated. The sagebrush I hid behind was wrong somehow. The leaves were too dark, almost black, and when I touched them, they felt oddly warm and slightly moist, as if they were perspiring. The ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, and with each step, I felt as though I was walking on something that might give way at any moment. That's when I saw more lights flick on, several lanterns or flashlights, revealing about a dozen figures in dark, flowing robes. They stood in a rough circle around something that looked like a low wooden table, or maybe a crude altar. The robes weren't just dark. They seemed to absorb light, creating human-shaped voids in the flickering illumination. The fabric moved in ways that didn't match the wind, rippling and undulating as if alive. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. The chanting was soft, rhythmic, but now I could hear it clearly. It wasn't English, wasn't any language I recognized. The syllables were harsh, guttural, with sounds that seemed to come from deep in the throat. They reminded me of the death rattle of some dying animal, but sustained and purposeful. I noticed a heavy smell in the air, like burning hair or something foul, and I had to stifle a gag. The odor was so thick I could taste it, metallic and rotten, coating my tongue and throat. It was the smell of corruption, of something that had been dead for far too long. I know how it sounds, like some B-movie plot, but I was there, crouched behind a bush, fighting the urge to run. The altar at the center of the circle was carved from what looked like a single piece of blackened wood, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. The wood itself appeared to be bleeding, dark stains that dripped steadily onto the ground below. The group parted slightly, and I saw an older man in the center holding what appeared to be a carved wooden staff. His face was visible in the lantern light, and I immediately wished it wasn't. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like looking into deep wells. When he smiled, his teeth were filed to points, and his tongue was an unnatural shade of purple. He lifted the staff, and I could see it was carved from the same dark wood as the altar, covered in the same writhing symbols. At its top was what looked like a human skull, but wrong, too elongated with too many teeth. The skull's empty sockets seemed to track my movement, following me as I shifted position behind the bush. Then he slammed it down onto the wooden surface with a sound like breaking bones. The chanting stopped dead, and every flashlight and lantern turned toward the direction I was hiding. The silence was absolute, crushing, as if the very air had been sucked away. I've never felt such dread, a terror so complete that it paralyzed me entirely. I ducked lower, half expecting them to charge at me, but they just stood there in utter silence, as if they could sense me but not pinpoint my location. The robed figures were perfectly still, like statues, but I could feel their attention focused on me with laser intensity. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. The man with the staff raised it again and began to speak in that same guttural language, but louder now, more urgent. As he spoke, the symbols on the altar began to glow with a sickly green light, and I heard a sound like sobbing coming from beneath the ground. The earth around the altar began to bulge upward, as if something was trying to push its way to the surface. I figured if I tried to sprint back to my car, they'd see me for sure, so I inched away, trying to keep my head down. My heart was pounding so hard I was worried they'd hear it. The soft ground made my retreat treacherous. With each step I felt like I might sink into some hidden pit. Just as I got a few yards back, something crunched under my boot. Broken glass maybe, or bones. The sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The group's lights swept my way and someone shouted in that same alien language. The voice was inhuman, a screech that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. I froze, but the lights kept moving, scanning the area like searchlights. The beams weren't normal white light. They had a reddish tinge that made everything they touched look like it was covered in blood. Another voice barked something that sounded like an order, and the entire circle started spreading out, moving with an unnatural gliding motion that suggested their feet never quite touched the ground. I took that moment to run. The soft ground that had hindered my retreat now seemed to grab at my feet as if trying to hold me back. Behind me I heard a sound like wind through a graveyard, followed by what could only be described as howling, not from dogs or wolves, but from human throats twisted into shapes that shouldn't be possible. By the time I reached my car, dust was swirling everywhere and the wind was howling. The dust wasn't ordinary, it was thick, almost viscous, and it clung to my skin like oil. Worse, it seemed to move with purpose, forming shapes and patterns that looked almost like faces before dissolving back into chaos. I threw myself in, locked the doors, and fired up the engine. The car struggled to start as if the battery was nearly dead, though it had been fine moments before. When it finally caught, the engine sounded different, rougher, more strained. In the rearview mirror, I could see beams of light moving fast like they were running, trying to catch me. But it wasn't just the lights that were pursuing me. In the mirror, I caught glimpses of the robed figures themselves, and they weren't running, they were floating. gliding across the ground with their arms outstretched, their robes billowing around them like dark wings. Their faces, when I could see them, were no longer human. They had become something else, something twisted and wrong. I floored it, fishtailing on the gravel before the tires found traction. The car lurched forward and I heard a sound like claws scraping against metal. Something had nearly caught me. In the side mirror, I saw one of the figures standing in the road behind me. Its arm extended as if it had been reaching for my car. Even from a distance, I could see that its hand was wrong. Too long with too many joints. The dirt road seemed to stretch on forever, far longer than it had when I'd driven in. The fence posts with their bone decorations flashed past like a nightmare corridor, and I swore I could hear the skulls chattering as I passed. The road twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember, leading me through landscapes that seemed to shift and change in my headlights. Finally, after what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, I saw the main highway ahead. I sped back toward it, the entire time expecting a truck to appear in my mirrors, but no one followed. When I reached the pavement, I felt a physical sensation of relief, as if I'd crossed some kind of protective barrier. But the relief was short-lived. As I drove toward Escalante, I noticed that my fuel gauge was reading nearly empty, though I'd had half a tank when I turned onto the dirt road. The radio was still dead, producing only that strange humming sound. Worse, the temperature gauge was reading dangerously high, though the heater was blowing cold air. I reached Escalante around 11 p.m., found a gas station that was thankfully still open, and just sat in my car for a good 15 minutes trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The attendant inside shot me a look that said I probably looked white as a sheet, which I'm sure I did. When I finally went inside to pay for gas, I caught sight of myself in the security mirror behind the counter. I looked like I'd aged 10 years in the past hour. My hair was streaked with that strange dust and my eyes were bloodshot and wild. There were scratches on my face and arms that I didn't remember getting, thin lines that looked almost like claw marks. I asked the attendant if there were any local groups who do night gatherings, and he just shrugged, said folks keep to themselves around here. But I noticed his hand trembled slightly as he made change, and he kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something outside. I pried a bit more, and he muttered something about rumors of robed strangers near Medicine Rock State Park, but that's miles from where I was. He said sometimes ranchers report weird bonfires on remote properties, but no one digs too deep out of fear of stumbling into something they'd rather not see. You didn't see nothing out there, did you? He asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. When I hesitated, his face went pale. Jesus, he said, backing away from the counter. You did, didn't you? You saw them. He wouldn't say anything more, just kept shaking his head and muttering under his breath. As I left, I heard him lock the door behind me and saw him pull down the blinds. The gas station's lights went out as I drove away. The next day, I tried to drive back to that area in daylight, but after an hour of searching, I couldn't find that same dirt road. Everything looked the same. Dusty tracks, fence posts, rolling plains. It was like the place had swallowed itself or perhaps had never existed at all. The landscape seemed normal in the daylight, even pleasant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped at every dirt road I could find, but none of them matched my memory. Some were too wide, others too narrow. Some had normal wooden fence posts, others had none at all. But nowhere did I find the tilted posts with their grisly decorations. Nowhere did I find that perfectly circular depression. What disturbed me most was that I began to doubt my own memory. In the harsh light of day, the events of the previous night seemed impossible, like something out of a horror movie. But the scratches on my arms were real, the dust in my hair was real, and my car still smelled of that sickly sweet corruption. That evening at a small motel, I overheard someone talking about cults in the region, how they meet in deserted areas and practice who knows what. It was just casual conversation between truckers, the usual small-town rumors and gossip. But the one time I mentioned seeing robes, the guy's face went pale. He said a relative of his once caught sight of a group wearing dark hoods in the countryside near Baker, Montana. And after that, the relative rarely left home at night. Changed him, the trucker said. Never was the same after. Started talking about things that shouldn't be, about things that live in the spaces between places. The trucker lowered his voice. My relative, he started drawing these symbols, covering the walls of his room with them. Said he had to keep them out. Had to remember the pattern so they couldn't follow him home. Found him one morning dead in his bed, but his face, He shuddered. His face was frozen in a scream, but his eyes were gone. Just empty sockets, like something had reached in and taken them. I left Escalante the following morning, telling myself I was just relieved to be putting distance between me and that memory. But I couldn't shake the image of that group standing around that table, or the way they moved like they were rehearsing an old routine, something ancient and practiced. The man with the staff, his black eyes, his pointed teeth. These images haunted me during the daylight hours and invaded my dreams at night. I felt almost guilty for seeing it, like I'd violated a boundary that was meant to keep certain things hidden from the world. There was a sense that I'd witnessed something that humans weren't supposed to see, something that existed in the dark spaces between civilization and wilderness. On my last night in Montana, in a motel near Miles City, I tried to do some quick, online searches about robed gatherings in southeastern Montana. Nothing substantial came up, just some talk about fringe religious sects and a few conspiracy theories referencing government cover-ups of desert cults, all too vague to tie anything directly to what I saw. But I did find something that made my blood run cold. In a genealogy forum, someone had posted about their family history in Carter County, mentioning that their great-grandfather had been part of a group that had made contact with the old powers in the 1920s. The post described rituals performed in circular depressions, ceremonies designed to thin the veil between worlds. The post had been deleted by the time I tried to read it again an hour later, but I'd saved the text. It mentioned that the group had been successful in their goals, that they'd managed to establish a permanent connection with entities from the spaces between spaces. The great-grandfather had supposedly lived to be 103, never aging past his 40th year, but had paid a price that wasn't specified. I did read an article about missing livestock in Carter County, though, with no culprit found. The article mentioned that the animals weren't just missing, they were found drained of blood with strange symbols carved into their hides. Local authorities had blamed it on a cult, but no arrests had ever been made. That was enough to make me lose my appetite. I drove straight home the next day, half expecting an unfamiliar vehicle to tail me all the way. Every car that stayed behind me for more than a few miles made me nervous, and I found myself taking random exits and back roads, anything to make sure I wasn't being followed. But the paranoia didn't end when I reached home. I started having dreams about the ritual, but in my dreams I was inside the circle, standing at the altar with the skull-topped staff in my hands. I could feel the power flowing through it, could understand the meaning of the symbols that covered its surface, and I liked it. I woke up from these dreams with scratches on my arms, just like the ones I'd gotten that night in Montana. Sometimes I'd find myself drawing symbols in the margins of newspapers or on napkins, patterns that looked disturbingly familiar. I'd throw them away immediately, but the compulsion to draw them grew stronger each day. I'm sharing this because it's been eating at me, consuming my thoughts and invading my dreams. If anyone else traveling through southeastern Montana encountered something like that, I'd feel less insane. The robed figures, the chanting, the abrupt hush, the man with the pointed teeth and black eyes, it all still wakes me up in cold sweats. It's not like I can tell a friend or coworker about this without sounding like I made up a ghost story. But I'm telling you, I was there. I heard them. I saw things that shouldn't exist. And I think they almost caught me that night, but more than that. I think they marked me somehow. The scratches keep appearing, and the dreams keep getting more vivid. Sometimes I find myself speaking words in that guttural language, understanding their meaning even though I've never heard them before. I've started avoiding mirrors because sometimes, just for a moment, my reflection shows someone else, someone with black eyes and pointed teeth. If something like this has happened to anyone else, or if folks around there know more about these gatherings, let me know. Maybe the less we keep these things in the dark, the better. But I'm starting to wonder if some things are meant to stay hidden, if some knowledge is too dangerous to share. Because whatever I saw that night, whatever I witnessed in that circular depression, it wasn't just a ritual. It was an invitation, and I'm afraid I might be starting to accept it. The dispatch crackled through the static like bones snapping in a fire. then died as the figure dragged a half-ton steer across County Road 12 and stared straight through my windshield. Its joints bent wrong, eyes like burn holes in parchment. I slammed the brakes too late and felt the cruiser rise suddenly, weightless for a heartbeat before crashing back to Earth. I'm Riley Hartman, and what I'm about to tell you took place in 2011 in Escalante, Utah. The desert here doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't forget them either. The day started slow, the way most days do before they turn into nightmares. I signed out a beat-up Crown Vic at 6 a.m., the keys still warm from the night shift deputy's sweaty palm. The coffee tasted of tin and regret, bitter enough to strip paint. I drove the red dirt loop past the grazing leases north of town, where the Mormon settlers had tried to make something green grow in all that emptiness. The morning sun painted the mesas the color of dried blood, and the wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that made my skin crawl without knowing why. A ranch hand waved me down before I even finished the cup. His face was the color of sour milk, and his hand shook as he pointed toward the grazing land. "You need to see this, officer. Need to see it right now." 2 Angus yearlings lay 40 yards apart, their spines snapped clean, ribs peeled open as if something had pried them with tire irons. The precision was what got to me first. No ragged tears, no claw marks, just surgical separation of flesh from bone. The morning flies hadn't even found them yet, as if they knew to stay away. No truck tracks scarred the hardpan. No coyote prints circled the carcasses. No sign of a fight, no drag marks leading away from the kill site. The cattle lay exactly where they'd fallen, their eyes wide and clouded, tongues swollen black between their teeth. But it was the emptiness that made my breakfast crawl up my throat. The hollow cavities where their organs should have been, cleaned out so thoroughly that the inner walls gleamed like polished marble. I marked the scene with orange cones, called it in, and waited for Deputy Addie Perez. The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. Even the meadowlarks had gone quiet, and in 20 years of working these counties, I'd never heard the desert hold its breath like that. Addie showed up 40 minutes later, chewing sunflower seeds and spitting the shells through her open window. She popped the hood on one calf, frowned at the emptiness inside like she was looking under the hood of a stripped car. "Whatever did this hauled them out like oysters," she said, her voice carrying too far in the thin air. Clean as a whistle, I told her to keep her voice down. The rancher, a tough Mormon named Clegg, looked ready to cry. His face had gone gray as cement, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. 40 years I've worked this land," he whispered. "Never seen anything like it. Never even heard stories." We walked the fence line, boots crunching on gravel that sounded like breaking glass. The barbed wire sagged like cut ribbon where something had passed through. The metal twisted into impossible spirals. On the far side, fresh drag marks led toward the slot canyons, grooves an inch deep, straight as survey stakes, too tidy for any scavenger I knew. The tracks were wrong from the start. They reminded me of a child's drawing of a hand, only backward with the thumb missing. Long, narrow impressions spaced less than a foot apart, each ending in 4 blunt points. But it was the spacing that made my scalp tighten. Precisely 32 inches between each print, measured to the millimeter. No variation, no hesitation, as if the thing moved like a machine. We followed the trail into the maze of sandstone corridors where the rock walls pressed close enough to touch both sides with outstretched arms. The desert kept silent except for our boots echoing off the stone, and the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like voices whispering in an empty church. Between sage clumps, we found more prints. Addie photographed them, but the images looked fake even on the camera screen. Too precise, too deliberate, as if someone had carved them with tools. The desert dust should have softened the edges, but these marks looked fresh as surgery scars. By noon, we'd hiked 3 miles into the slots. Sunlight thinned to a hard blue strip above us, and the air smelled of wet stone, though the soil was dust dry. The walls rose higher with each step, closing overhead like a stone coffin. Radio contact faded first to static, then to nothing. Addie tapped her handset, shrugged, and mouthed, "Keep close." I kept my sidearm drawn, though I couldn't say what I expected to shoot. The marks on the ground never wavered, never crossed each other, as if the thing glided without weight. They led us deeper into the labyrinth, past pictographs left by people who'd fled this place centuries ago, their painted figures running from something with too many arms. Then the tracks just stopped on a smooth sandstone shelf. No blood, no calves, no exit prints, only a shallow depression the size of a bathtub polished like glass. The stone around it had been worn smooth, as if something had rested there for a very long time. Addie crouched to study it, her camera clicking in the silence. "Riley," she whispered, "look at this." The depression wasn't empty. Carved into the stone were symbols, not pictographs, but something older, something that hurt to look at directly. They spiraled inward toward the center, where a single hole disappeared into darkness. The air rising from it carried the scent of copper and meat gone bad. That's when we heard it. The hiss wasn't a roar, wasn't even loud. Just a sound like air escaping from a punctured lung, but it poured out of the darkness behind us with the weight of centuries. The stone walls caught it and threw it back, multiplying the whisper until it surrounded us like a living thing. I swung around, saw nothing but shadows dancing in the slot canyon's depths. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, thick and expectant like the pause before a scream. When I turned back, Addie was gone. The grip of her camera still hung in midair for a blink, suspended like a magic trick, then clattered on the rock. The sound echoed off the walls, sharp as gunshots. I called her name until my throat hurt, but the canyon answered with metallic echoes that sounded like other people pretending to be me. "Addie," my voice cracked on the second syllable. "Addie, where are you?" The silence stretched like a held breath. Then from somewhere deep in the maze, I heard her voice. Riley, help me." But it wasn't quite right. The words came too slowly, with spaces between them like someone reading from a script, and underneath that same wet hiss, as if something was learning to speak with a mouthful of blood. I backed up the way we'd come, tracing my own footprints in the dust. The walls seemed to lean inward, pressing closer with each step. The strip of sky above narrowed to a thread of blue, and the shadows grew teeth. "Riley, I'm hurt. I can't move." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the stone like a ball in a box. It was Addie's voice, but wrong. Too high, too breathless, like air being forced through a broken reed. Each word seemed to take enormous effort. I drew my weapon, though my hands shook so badly I could barely hold it. The slot canyon branched ahead. Left led deeper into the maze, right curved back toward the surface. The voice came from the left, pleading now. "Don't leave me here, please, it's so dark." Something glittered in the sand at my feet. Addie's badge, the metal twisted into a spiral that made my eyes water to follow. Beside it, a dark stain soaked into the dust, too black to be blood, too thick to be water. 5 minutes later, I was running. The canyon walls blurred past, and my breath came in sharp gasps that echoed like sobs. Every shadow looked like reaching arms. Every wind sound like that terrible hiss. Behind me, the voice kept calling. But it was changing, becoming something else. Something that had learned her words, but not her fear. 20 minutes after that, I cleared the slots and found my cruiser baking in the sun. I poured water over my head until I could breathe again, but the taste of copper wouldn't leave my mouth. My radio squawked with static, and for a moment I thought I heard Addie's voice underneath the noise, still calling my name. Back at the station, the chief told me we'd lost enough men in those rocks to old mine shafts and sudden floods. "We wait for daylight," he said, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. I reminded him it was still daylight. The sun blazed overhead, brutal and white, but something in the air made it feel like dusk. He rubbed the badge on his chest like a worry stone and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The station felt different, too quiet, too still. The fluorescent lights flickered with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat, and the coffee in the break room had gone cold, though I'd made it fresh an hour ago. Through the window, I could see the slot canyons in the distance, their shadows darker than they should be. I tried to write up a report, but the words wouldn't come. How do you describe the sound of someone being erased? How do you explain the weight of absence, the shape of a person-sized hole in the world? The phone rang. I picked it up, hoping for news, for anything that made sense. "Riley?" The voice was soft, familiar. "I'm still here. I'm still waiting." I slammed the phone down, but it kept ringing. Each ring sounded like a scream. I borrowed the department's infrared scope and a .308 rifle from the armory they kept for mountain lions. The weapon felt solid in my hands, real in a way nothing else had since the canyon. I signed the log with shaking fingers and took the cruiser out again, driving toward something I couldn't name but knew was waiting. Dusk bled into the gulches like spilled wine, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. The desert never held heat after sundown, but tonight felt different, colder, hungrier, as if the darkness was feeding on the warmth. On the ridge above Clegg's ranch, Turkey vultures circled but refused to land. They rode the thermals in tight spirals, their shadows wheeling across the ground like clock hands, but they wouldn't descend, wouldn't take what the desert offered. Even they knew something was wrong. The cattle huddled in the far corner of the main pen, their eyes rolling white in the gathering darkness. They pressed against the fence until the wire sang with tension, and the sound of their breathing came in sharp, panicked bursts. Whatever had visited them before, they remembered. At 2013 hours, the stockyard light snapped off. Not dimmed, not flickered. They died all at once as if someone had thrown a switch. My dashboard lights followed, gauges fading to black. The radio gave a burst of static and went silent. I coasted to a stop, engine quiet, and heard metal banging inside the main pen. The sound came in steady intervals, like a heartbeat, like breathing. Using the rifle's optic like a camera, I scanned the yard. The cattle crowded the far fence, their bodies pressed so tight together, they looked like a single, many-legged creature. Their eyes caught the starlight and threw it back in points of fire. Near the feed bins, where the shadows were deepest, something moved. It stood taller than the gatepost, hairless, the color of butcher paper left too long in the sun. Its skin stretched over cables of muscle that twitched in steady ripples like water disturbed by wind. The thing had no head, no eyes, just a torso that divided at the sternum into two equal halves that opened and closed like saloon doors. Behind the opening, I glimpsed raw meat and a curtain of cartilage that moved like seaweed in a current. The sound it made was wet and rhythmic, like a great lung breathing through water. As I watched, it lifted a heifer by the hips, a 1,000-pound animal raised like a child's toy, and folded it into itself without bending its own limbs. The cow disappeared into that terrible opening with barely a sound, just a soft, wet sigh. The thing's chest snapped shut like a trap, and for a moment it stood perfectly still, digesting. Then it turned toward my hiding place with that same precise 32-inch stride. I fired. The round slapped flesh with a sound like a hammer hitting meat. A bloom of dark spray hit the dirt, but the thing didn't drop. It paused, swaying slightly, then continued its approach. The wound pinched shut, leaving only powdery residue around the hole, as if it were made of clay that could reshape itself. I retreated to the grain silo, my boots ringing on the metal ladder. The bent sheet metal door slammed behind me, and I barricaded it with a pallet, though I knew it wouldn't hold. Inside the domed roof, the smell of mildew and rotting corn felt thick enough to chew. I lay flat on the catwalk, rifle barrel through a rust hole, and waited. The silence stretched like a held breath. Then the tin buckled below, and a pale arm, jointed wrong, bending in too many places, probed through the door gap. The fingers were wrong, too. Paddle-wide boneless pads ringed with short claws more suited to scooping than grabbing. They moved with deliberate intelligence, testing the air, learning the space. Another arm followed, then another, until the door creased outward like tin foil. The hinges shrieked as the shape slid inside, rising until its back brushed the silo roof. In the dim light, I could see it clearly for the first time. The open torso tilted toward me, ribs flexing like fingers. And I understood that this wasn't a mouth, it was something else, something worse. It moved by rocking its hips, tipping like a crane, its body always balanced despite its impossible height. No mouth sounds, no breathing, just the wet whisper of its chest opening and closing. The smell that rose from it was copper and meat and something else, something that made my hindbrain scream. I remembered the methane tap feeding the grain dryer, illegal but ancient. Clegg had never upgraded, and the line ran right through the silo floor. I crab-crawled to the ladder hatch, dropped 2 rungs, and reached the valve with my boot. Steel groaned as I turned it. Gas hissed into the enclosed space, rising high and mean. The shape reacted, swaying, its chest slamming shut for the first time. The sound reminded me of a giant envelope being sealed, final and absolute. I sparked a road flare and tossed it onto the floor. The gas caught with a thud and a flash of white heat that seared my eyebrows. The explosion blew upward, punched me through the hatch, and threw the shape against the far wall where it writhed in flames without giving voice. I hit the ground outside, rolled toward the irrigation ditch, and plunged headfirst into water so cold it stopped my heart for a beat. Behind me, the silo ejected a column of smoke and shrapnel that rained down like burning snow. When I crawled out, the yard lights flickered back on. The silo's roof lay twisted 10 yards away, and embers drifted through the air like fireflies. I circled with the rifle raised, but found no trace of the thing. only a long smear of grayish ash leading to the tree line. As if something had dragged a sack of cement toward the hills. The cattle had gone quiet. They stood in the far corner of the pen, no longer panicked but not calm either. They watched the tree line with the patience of prey that knows the predator is only sleeping. The explosion's echo rolled across the desert like thunder, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my eardrums with the weight of judgment, and somewhere in that quiet I heard the sound of something moving through the trees. Not footsteps, something else, something that didn't need feet to travel. I kept the rifle trained on the ash smear, my finger tight on the trigger. The gray residue glittered in the yard lights like ground glass, and as I watched, it began to move. Not scattered by wind, but flowing, gathering itself into streams that crept toward the fence line. The cattle saw it too. They pressed back against the far corner of the pen, their bodies shuddering with each breath. One of them, a young bull with a white patch on his forehead, let out a sound I'd never heard before. Not a bellow, not a moo, but something closer to a human scream. The ash streams reached the fence and began to climb. They flowed up the posts like liquid mercury, defying gravity, seeking something. Where they touched the barbed wire, the metal began to change. The steel grew soft, malleable, twisting into spirals that hurt to look at directly. I backed toward the irrigation ditch, but the water had gone black. Not dark, black like ink or blood or something worse. The surface didn't reflect the yard lights anymore, just swallowed them whole. As I watched, bubbles rose from the depths, each one carrying a whisper. Riley. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Riley, help me. It was Addie's voice, but wrong. Too wet, too hollow, like someone speaking through a mouthful of liquid. The words came with the smell of copper and decay, and underneath, that same wet hiss I'd heard in the canyon. I'm cold. Riley, I'm so cold. The ash had finished climbing the fence and was spreading across the ground like a living thing. Where it touched the earth, the grass withered and turned gray. The cattle were silent now, their eyes wide with an intelligence that didn't belong in animal faces. I ran toward the road, boots pounding on hardpan, but the cruiser was gone. In its place stood a figure that might have been human once, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down past its knees. It turned toward me with a motion like a flower following the sun. The face was the worst part. It had Addie's features, but they were stretched like taffy, pulled into shapes that belonged in a funhouse mirror. The eyes were too wide, too bright, and they held no recognition, only hunger. Found you, it said, and the voice was definitely hers now, but coming from the wrong throat. Been looking so long. I raised the rifle, sighted on the center of its chest, and pulled the trigger. The round passed through it like smoke, and the thing laughed with Addie's voice. The sound echoed off the rocks, multiplying until it surrounded me like a chorus of ghosts. Behind the figure, more shapes emerged from the darkness. They moved with that same 32-inch stride, but they weren't all the same. Some were tall and pale like the first, others squat and dark. One crawled on too many arms, its face a mass of moving parts that might have been eyes or mouths or something else entirely. But they all had one thing in common. They were wearing pieces of people I'd known. A deputy's badge here, a rancher's hat there, a woman's earrings dangling from flesh that had never been human. They were collectors, I realized. Gatherers of identity, wearing their victims like clothes. The one with Addie's face reached out with fingers that stretched like rubber bands. They wrapped around my wrist, and where they touched, my skin began to burn, not with heat, but with cold so intense it felt like fire. Come with us, it said. Come home. I jerked away, leaving skin behind, and stumbled toward the grain silo. The metal was still hot from the explosion, but it felt real in a way nothing else did. I pressed my back against it and raised the rifle again, though I knew it wouldn't help. The shapes circled me like wolves, their movements perfectly synchronized. They didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't make any sound except for the wet whisper of their passage. One of them, the one that had been in the silo, had reformed itself, its pale flesh smooth and unmarked by the flames. You can't kill us, it said, speaking with the voice of someone I'd never heard before. We're already dead. Have been for a long time. The circle tightened. I could smell them now. Copper and meat and something else, something that made my stomach turn. The smell of things that should have been buried, should have been forgotten, but kept walking anyway. That's when I remembered the flare, still clutched in my left hand, its chemical glow guttering but not dead. I cracked it against the silo wall and red light flared between us. The shapes recoiled, their forms wavering like smoke. "Light," one of them hissed. "It burns." I held the flare high and they backed away. Not far, just enough to give me breathing room, but I could see others gathering at the edge of the red glow, more than I could count, their eyes reflecting the light like mirrors. "What do you want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The one with Addie's face smiled, and I saw that its teeth were too sharp. Too many. "To go home," it said. "To take everyone home." "Where's home?" It pointed toward the slot canyons, toward the darkness between the rocks where no light had ever reached. "Down there. Down where it's quiet. Down where nothing changes." The flare was dying. I could feel the heat fading, see the red glow dimming. When it went out, they would come for me and I would become another collector, another shape in their terrible parade. But then I heard something else. The sound of engines, of vehicles racing across the desert. Headlights swept across the yard and the shapes scattered like roaches, flowing back toward the trees in the darkness beyond. The cavalry had arrived, but I wasn't sure they were ready for what they'd find. At dawn, state troopers combed the site like archaeologists, their cameras flashing in the gray light. They found Addie's radio first, then her badge, fused to a strip of pink tissue near the smashed feed bin. The tissue carried human DNA markers, but no match in any database, as if it belonged to someone who had never existed. The tissue was wrong in other ways, too. Under the microscope, it showed cellular structures that bent light in impossible directions, crystals of something that shouldn't exist in living matter. The lab techs whispered about it in the corners, their voices tight with fear they couldn't name. The prints in the canyon had turned brittle overnight and crumbled under the first boot that touched them. What had been clear tracks the day before became nothing more than disturbed dust, as if the desert itself was erasing the evidence. They questioned me for 7 hours in a room that smelled of stale coffee and fear. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead and every shadow looked like reaching arms. I gave them my notes, my photos, my rounds counted and recounted. The digital files showed nothing but static, and the photographs were blank except for one. A single image of something pale standing in the background of a crime scene photo, something that hadn't been there when I took the picture. They thanked me, typed it up as an animal attack, and shipped the report to a locker none of us will ever open. The official story was predators, maybe a pack of feral dogs. The missing deputy was listed as a hiking accident, presumed fallen into one of the many chasms that honeycomb the desert. But I knew better. I'd seen the way the other officers looked at me, the way they stepped aside when I walked down the hall. They'd read my report, seen the photos, and they knew that something had come out of the deep places of the earth to hunt. Addie's status changed from missing to deceased, presumed. Her funeral was held on a Tuesday, and I was the only one who came. The casket was empty, of course, there wasn't enough left to bury. But I stood there anyway, in the heat and the silence, and tried to remember her as she'd been before the canyon took her. The preacher spoke about souls and redemption, about the peace that comes after suffering. But I kept thinking about the thing that had worn her face, the way it had smiled with too many teeth. Some things I realized don't find peace, they just find new ways to hurt. I handed the chief my resignation the next morning. He signed without looking up, his hand shaking as he wrote his name. "Maybe it's for the best," he said. "Maybe some things are better left alone." On the way out, I passed the evidence freezer. The door was ajar, and inside on the top shelf lay my flare, half melted but somehow intact. It was covered in a thin layer of white dust that shimmered under the fluorescent light as if alive. I reached for it, then stopped. The dust was moving, flowing in patterns that reminded me of circuit boards or neural networks. As I watched, it began to spell out words in a language I didn't recognize, symbols that made my eyes water and my head ache. I left the flare where it was and walked away. Some evidence is too dangerous to preserve. I drove south until the desert turned green, past cities where the lights stayed on at night and the shadows behaved the way shadows should. I found work as a security guard at a shopping mall, watching teenagers steal candy and old men sleep on benches. Simple problems with simple solutions. But I never forgot Escalante. How could I? The memory lived in my bones, in the way I checked the locks twice before sleeping, in the way I avoided dark places and kept a flashlight by my bed. The desert had marked me, and some marks never fade. Sometimes late at night I still hear the radio static that sounds like voices calling from far away. Sometimes I catch glimpses of pale figures at the edges of my vision, moving with that same 32-inch stride. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, I hear Addie's voice whispering through the static. Riley, help me. I'm so cold. But I know better now. I know that some things that call for help aren't looking for rescue. They're looking for company, for someone to share the darkness with. And I've learned that the best way to help the dead is to let them stay that way. The desert keeps its secrets, and I've learned to keep mine. But every sunrise still feels darker than the night that tried to swallow me whole. And I know that somewhere in the slot canyons of Utah, something is still waiting. Still hunting. Still wearing the faces of the people it's taken. And sometimes, on nights when the static is particularly loud, I wonder if it's learned to wear mine too. I have not worn a badge since. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. Some hungers once awakened can never be satisfied. And some things that come from the deep places of the earth should never be disturbed. But they are disturbed, aren't they? Every day, people like me venture into the empty places, the forgotten places, the places where the old rules don't apply. They follow strange tracks and investigate unusual sounds, and most of them come back with stories that end up filed away in lockers no one will ever open. Most of them. But not all. The desert is patient. It can wait. And somewhere in the darkness between the rocks, something that was never human is still learning to be me. The end is just another beginning. And the hunt never really stops. It just finds new prey. By noon, I was knee-deep in pinon needles, tracking the screaming that crackled over my radio when a red ranger hat rolled past my boots, still warm and sticky underneath. And I knew the forest was keeping score against us. My name is Gabe Montoya, and this happened to me back in 2011 in the Cibola National Forest of New Mexico. The shift started simple. Check a blocked service road near the old copper shaft. Make sure weekend campers signed the log. Be back in time to catch the Isotopes game on AM. But the forest had other plans. The morning began with that peculiar stillness that sets every ranger's teeth on edge. No bird calls, no insect hum. Just the whisper of wind through ponderosa that sounded too much like breathing. I should have turned around then. Should have radioed in sick and let someone else handle whatever was stirring in those ancient hills. Then dispatch patched. In a report of 2 missing bird watchers by Sandia Crest, they tossed me the call. Because I know those switchbacks blindfolded. 23 years walking these trails. And I've seen plenty of folks get turned around, twist an ankle, or simply lose track of time while chasing a rare species through the underbrush. Standard stuff. I slung the agency AR-15 over my shoulder, filled a thermos with Bitter Station coffee, and rolled out in the dusty green Tacoma. The radio chattered with routine calls, campers asking about fire restrictions, hikers wondering about trail conditions, normal, safe. Halfway up the ridge, everything changed. Ranger Dave Corrales broke radio discipline, his voice splitting through the static like a scream through glass. He was yelling, gasping, forming sounds that weren't quite words. The transmission cut to silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Dave was a wiry college kid from Las Cruces, too new to even own a proper multi-tool, but he never fooled around on comms. Kid took regulation seriously, almost to a fault. I'd never heard him raise his voice, let alone break protocol. I pinned the mic to my chest. Dave, this is Montoya. Repeat your last transmission. Nothing. Dave, do you copy? The silence hummed back at me like something alive, something patient. I pushed the Tacoma harder up the switchbacks, gravel pinging off the undercarriage. The trees seemed to lean closer with each turn, their shadows pooling in places where sunlight should have fallen freely. By the time I reached the Crest parking lot, my hands were slick with sweat despite the mountain chill. I met Lisa Pollard at the trailhead. Lisa was senior ranger, a woman who could field dress an elk with a Leatherman and track a wounded bear through a thunderstorm. She hated drama, prided herself on staying level under pressure, but one glance at my face and she clicked the safety off her sidearm. Dave's in trouble, I said. How bad? Bad enough that he stopped using words. We split up. Lisa headed downhill toward the oak scrub where the birdwatchers had been spotted that morning. I took the upslope toward the basalt outcrop where Dave's GPS signal had last pinged. The plan was simple. Find him, assess the situation, call for backup if needed. The trail showed fresh boot prints, size 9 Merrill hiking boots veering hard off the maintained path. Dave's prints running, not jogging, not hurrying, Running like hell was snapping at his heels. The spacing between footfalls suggested panic, the kind of stride you only see when someone's fighting for their life. A smear of blood led to a ponderosa trunk gashed elbow high, as if something with farm equipment for claws had taken a casual swipe. The bark hung in strips, revealing pale wood that wept sap like tears, but there were no tracks after that point. Just a drag mark that vanished into the pine duff as if whatever had made it had simply evaporated. That's when I heard the wind chimes. They rattled from an abandoned fire lookout tower ahead, brass tubes singing their hollow song despite the fact that there was no wind. Not even a breath of breeze stirred the pine needles at my feet, yet those chimes kept ringing with increasing urgency, as if trying to warn me away. I climbed the ladder anyway. Each rung clanged like an alarm bell in the stillness, echoing off the canyon walls below. My rifle banged against my back with every step, a comforting weight that felt suddenly inadequate. Inside the observation deck, Dave's pack lay open like a gutted animal. Field guides scattered across the floor, their pages fluttering without wind. His water bladder had been slashed, leaving dark stains on the wooden planks. A brand new handheld radio sat gutted of its batteries, wires trailing like entrails. His phone lay beside it, screen spiderwebbed but still glowing. The camera app was frozen on a single frame, a blurred image that made my stomach clench. Something tall stood in the background, gray-green and wrong, its limbs jointed in ways that hurt to look at. The thing was bending toward the camera, toward Dave, with what might have been curiosity or hunger. The angle suggested Dave had lifted the phone over his head and snapped the photo in panic, probably while running or falling backwards. Whatever was in that image had been close enough to touch him. A raw noise floated up from somewhere below, half whistle, half cough, like air being forced through a windpipe that wasn't quite human. I couldn't place the direction. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the canyon walls in ways that made my inner ear ache. It stopped the moment I consciously noticed it, like someone testing whether I'd caught on. I backed down the ladder slowly, keeping my rifle ready and my eyes on the tree line. The forest felt wrong now, as if some fundamental rule had been broken. The shadows fell at impossible angles, and the air tasted metallic like pennies dissolving under my tongue. I picked my way toward the copper shaft, following the fading drag marks and my growing sense of dread. The abandoned mine was a scar in the mountain, 30 feet of open maw fenced off with flimsy chain, link and hung with do not enter signs that locals had turned into Swiss cheese with target practice. The hangar fence today was peeled open like a sardine can. Standing at the entrance, I called out, "Dave, you in there?" What came back wasn't an echo. It was breath, slow, measured, from something that knew how to stay unseen. The sound had weight to it, presence, like the exhalation of something much larger than it should be. The hairs on my arms lifted one by one as I clicked on my flashlight and stepped into the mine. The beam cut through darkness thick as molasses, revealing support timbers that hadn't felt boots in decades. Water dripped somewhere in the depths, each drop echoing like a countdown. The tunnel stretched deeper than my light could reach, sloping downward into the mountain's bowels. Old rail tracks ran along the floor, rusted and broken, disappearing into blackness that seemed to swallow sound. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the smell of copper and something else, something organic and spoiled. My flashlight beam snagged on a shape at the first bend. A ranger hat, red wool, brim crushed and dark with moisture. Dave's hat. Beside it lay a hand still wearing Dave's class ring from NMSU, but it wasn't attached to anything I could call Dave anymore. The hand was pale, drained of blood, with fingernails torn to the quick as if he'd tried to claw his way out of something. Teeth marks ringed the wrist, not human teeth, but something with too many points and gaps in all the wrong places. I don't freeze. 23 years of training drills it out of you. I stepped back, clicked off the safety, and brought my rifle to a steady sight picture on the darkness ahead. Something slid behind the support beams with a sound like wet leather across rough wood. I caught a glimpse of legs folding like a pocket knife, vertebrae cracking one at a time as it squeezed between timber supports that should have been too narrow for anything larger than a raccoon. The thing unfolded in the shadows, gray-green skin mottled with rust stains and lichen growths that moved independently, like tiny fingers feeling the air. Its head brushed the ceiling 10 feet up even while hunched. It had no eyes that I could spot, just a yawning slit of a jaw whose edges trembled as if sniffing for heat. When it opened that mouth, I saw rows of teeth like broken glass, and behind them, a throat that descended far deeper than anatomy should allow. The smell hit me then, copper and rotting meat and something else. Something that reminded me of the way hospitals smell just before someone dies. I fired one shot center mass. The impact thudded wetly, and the thing jerked sideways as splinters fanned out from the timber behind it. But it kept moving, slower now, but with the deliberate patience of something that had all the time in the world. It never made a sound. I fired again, aiming for what I hoped were knees. The joints bent the wrong way and absorbed the round like wet clay, dimpling and reforming without apparent damage. The thing began to move toward me with a gait that defied physics, flowing between the support beams like smoke, while somehow remaining solid enough to disturb the dust on the tunnel floor. Somewhere behind me, Lisa's voice crackled over the radio. "Montoya, get out now!" Her tone carried 20 years of authority and something else, terror so pure it cut through static like a blade. I ran. The creature followed, or at least I thought it did. I couldn't hear footsteps, but I felt its presence like ice water between my shoulder blades. The tunnel mouth ahead seemed to retreat with each step, as if the mine itself was stretching to keep me inside. When I finally burst into sunlight, I kept running until the tree line thinned and my lungs burned with mountain air. Lisa was waiting for me, her face a mask of sweat and dust, her usually steady hand shaking as she reloaded her sidearm. "What did you find?" I gasped. "The bird watchers," she said, "or what was left." She wouldn't describe it, but I saw it in her eyes, the same look Dave must have had when he took that photo. The look of someone who'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that broke the rules simply by being. We radioed incident command, requested state police, search and rescue, anyone with breathing lungs and functioning firearms. Response time, 90 minutes minimum. Dispatch's voice crackled back with bureaucratic concern, asking for details we couldn't provide without sounding insane. How do you explain that something was hunting in the forest? Something that moved like liquid shadow and left bodies drained of more than just blood. We couldn't leave. A family of 4 had permits at nearby Cedro Peak campground, due out by dusk, now unaccounted for. Protocol demanded we verify their safety before withdrawing. Lisa and I laced fresh magazines into our weapons, checked our knives, and headed north through timber that seemed to lean in closer with each step. Every shadow looked wrong. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of a raven, carried undertones that set my teeth on edge. The forest was watching us, weighing us, deciding whether we were worth the effort. The campground sat deserted except for an empty Subaru with Minnesota plates and a smoldering fire ring. Marshmallows had melted on sticks, forgotten in the coals. A Coleman lantern hung from a nearby branch, still burning despite the afternoon sun. Coffee percolated in a camp pot, the liquid black and bitter. A trail of small sneakers led into the arroyo behind the campsite, child-sized prints in the sandy soil, along with larger adult footprints and strange impressions that looked like the marks of elongated hands with too many joints. We followed the trail deeper into the cut, where sunlight failed early between sheer rock walls. The air grew cold and stagnant, thick with the smell of stagnant water and something else, something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. At the far end of the arroyo stood an old Forest Service pump house, a squat concrete building that hadn't been used in decades. The steel door was propped shut from the outside with a fallen log, and something inside was making noise, small fists pounding against metal, a girl's voice pleading for mom. I yanked the log away and swung the door open. A woman and her 2 kids spilled out, wild-eyed and hyperventilating. The mother was maybe 35, blonde hair matted with sweat and dirt. The children couldn't have been older than 8 and 10, a boy and a girl with matching terror-blank stares. Their story came in sobs and fragments. They'd been roasting marshmallows when something tall moved between the trees, something made of shadows and branches that smelled like copper and wet earth. It had watched them for what felt like hours, just standing at the edge of their firelight, patient as stone. When it finally moved, it ignored the screaming family and took the father in one fluid motion. No struggle, no chase, just a casual reach across the fire ring and the man was gone, carried away like a child's doll. The mother had grabbed the kids and run, following half-remembered directions to the pump house her husband had pointed out earlier. They'd barricaded themselves inside and waited, listening to sounds outside that didn't match any animal they knew. Lisa was scanning the ridges while I kept my muzzle pointed down, trying to look reassuring for the children. "We escort them to the truck," she said quietly. "Then we get the husband." She didn't have to add alive if possible. We both knew better. I told the family to hold hands and move slow, to stay between Lisa and me no matter what happened. The walk back to the campground should have taken 5 minutes. We'd covered maybe 50 yards when brush cracked somewhere above us. I turned in time to see Lisa raise her pistol toward the rocks. Something dropped from the canyon wall faster than gravity should allow, a tangle of gray-green limbs that hit her shoulders with enough force to drive her to her knees. Bones popped like kindling. She emptied her clip into its torso point blank, each muzzle flash strobing white in the gathering dusk. The thing absorbed every round without flinching, its flesh rippling like water around the impact points. It shifted its weight, legs splaying like a mantis preparing to strike, and dragged her uphill toward the rocks. Her boots raked sparks on stone as she fought, drawing her knife and stabbing at whatever part of the creature she could reach. She screamed once, a short, sharp syllable cut off with surgical precision. Then nothing. The family ran. I wanted to chase them to keep them safe, but the ridge erupted in dust and falling stones. I saw their silhouettes tumble into the thorn scrub below, the mother trying to shield her children as something gray-green flowed after them with impossible grace. My rifle barked in 3-shot bursts. Dust flew, bark shredded, rock chips sang through the air. The thing barely paused, moving with the fluid certainty of water finding its level. I regrouped with the mother and kids behind a boulder field, all of us breathing hard and bleeding from thorn scratches. The boy was maybe 8 with sandy hair and his father's stubborn chin. He'd stopped crying and gone silent, which was somehow worse. "What's your name?" I asked him. "James," he whispered. His sister couldn't have been older than 10. "I'm Sarah," she said, though I hadn't asked. "Is Daddy coming back?" I didn't answer because I didn't know how to lie to children about monsters. The sun died behind the canyon walls, and with it went any pretense of safety. The creature owned the darkness, moved through it like a fish through water. We huddled behind the boulder field while night settled around us like a suffocating blanket. The mother's name was Karen, and she kept asking about her husband, Michael, in a voice that grew smaller with each repetition. I'd seen enough accident scenes to recognize shock setting in. The glassy stare, the trembling hands, the way she kept reaching for someone who wasn't there anymore. "He said he'd be right back," she whispered. "Just going to get more firewood." "He always gets the firewood." James sat pressed against my side, his small body radiating heat and terror. His sister Sarah clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, its fur matted with dirt and tears. Neither child spoke, but their breathing came in short, sharp bursts that sounded too loud in the darkness. I checked my rifle. 2 magazines left plus the half-empty one in the weapon. 60 rounds total against something that had shrugged off close-range pistol fire like mosquito bites. The math wasn't encouraging. "Is it gone?" Karen asked. I listened to the night sounds, or rather the absence of them. No insects chirped, no owls called, no small animals rustled through the underbrush. Even the wind had died, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt alive. "No," I said. "It's still here." As if summoned by my words, something scraped against rock above us. Not the casual scratch of claws on stone, but something deliberate, measured, the sound of patience wearing thin. I clicked on my flashlight and immediately regretted it. The beam revealed the creature perched on a ledge 20 feet above, its elongated limbs folded beneath it like a sleeping bat, those non-eyes turned toward our light, and its jaw hinged open wider than anatomy should allow. The smell hit us then, copper and decay and something else, something that reminded me of the way my grandfather's house had smelled just before he died. Sweet corruption, life turning inside out. I fired 3 rounds at center mass. The impacts knocked chunks from the rock wall, but the thing was already moving, flowing down the cliff face like liquid shadow. It touched the ground and immediately melted back into darkness, leaving only the lingering stench and the sound of our terrified breathing. "It's playing with us," I realized. The truth hit like ice water in my veins. This thing could have taken us at any point. It had killed Dave, the birdwatchers, Lisa, probably Michael too. It was fast enough to snatch a man from beside a campfire, strong enough to drag a trained ranger up a cliff face. and tough enough to absorb rifle rounds without slowing down. But it hadn't killed us. Not yet. Why? Sarah whispered as if reading my thoughts. I don't know, sweetheart. But I was starting to suspect. The way it had ignored the screaming family to take only the father. The way it had carried Lisa away instead of finishing us on the spot. The careful, patient stalking that felt less like hunting and more like selection. It was choosing. Taking one at a time, savoring the terror of those left behind. We need to move, I said. Stay low, stay quiet, stay together. We crept through the boulder field like ghosts, placing each step with exaggerated care. Every shadow looked wrong, every sound made us freeze. The creature was out there somewhere, watching, waiting for the right moment to take another piece of our diminishing group. James stumbled on loose rock, and the sound echoed off the canyon walls like gunshots. We froze, listening to the silence that followed. Nothing moved, but the air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent attention. That's when I heard it, a sound like wet breathing coming from directly above us. I looked up to see the creature clinging to the underside of a stone overhang, its impossible anatomy allowing it to hang like a spider from what should have been a smooth surface. Those tooth-filled jaws hung open, dripping something that steamed when it hit the ground. Run, I whispered. We scattered as the thing dropped among us. Karen stumbled, went down hard on the rocky ground. The creature flowed toward her with predatory grace, but I was already moving, firing as I ran. My rounds sparked off stone and punched through empty air as the thing danced away from each muzzle flash. It could have taken Karen then, should have. Instead, it retreated into darkness, leaving her sobbing in the dirt with only scratches to show for the encounter. Still playing. Still choosing. I hauled Karen to her feet and pulled the family toward what I hoped was better cover. Behind us, something laughed. A sound like breaking glass mixed with human vocal cords. We made it to the pump house as dawn bled gray light across the canyon walls. 20 hours since Dave's first panicked radio call, and I was down to my last magazine. The family huddled inside the concrete structure while I kept watch through the steel door's narrow window. The creature was still out there. I could feel its presence like pressure behind my eyes, patient and hungry and utterly alien. It had taken Michael sometime during the night. We'd heard his screams echoing off the canyon walls, growing fainter and more desperate before cutting off with surgical precision. Karen had stopped asking about her husband. She sat in the corner cradling her children, all three of them silent now. Shock having burned away everything except the animal need to survive. Daddy's not coming back, is he? James finally whispered. No, son, he's not. Sarah began to cry, not the loud, dramatic sobs of a frightened child, but the quiet, hopeless tears of someone who understood too much too young. My radio crackled with static, then cleared enough for me to catch fragments of transmission. State police had finally arrived at the trailhead, along with search and rescue teams and what sounded like federal agents. Help was coming, but they'd have to find us first. The pump house had a landline, an old rotary phone connected to buried cables that still carried signal. I called in our position, reported multiple casualties, requested immediate extraction by armed personnel. The dispatcher's voice sounded impossibly distant, as if coming from another world where monsters didn't exist. ETA 15 minutes, she said. Can you hold position? I looked at the family, at their haunted faces and torn clothes and eyes that had seen too much. We'll hold. But the creature had other plans. The attack came with the sound of rending metal. The steel door, designed to keep out vandals and animals, peeled away like aluminum foil. Concrete chunks rained down as impossible strength tore through barriers that should have been impregnable. The thing flowed into the pump house like liquid nightmare, all joints and angles and teeth. In the confines of the small building, it seemed even larger, filling the space with its presence and that overwhelming stench of copper and decay. I emptied my last magazine into its center mass at point-blank range. Every round hit, punching through that gray-green hide and sending black ichor spattering across the walls. The creature paused, tilted its head with something that might have been curiosity, then continued forward. Take the kids, I shouted to Karen as I drew my knife. Run. But there was nowhere to run. The thing filled the doorway, blocking any escape. Its non-eyes fixed on the family, and that horrible jaw hinged open to reveal the endless throat beyond. That's when I understood. The copper mine. the metallic taste in the air, the way bodies were left drained and empty. This thing wasn't just killing, it was feeding, drawing something essential from its victims that went beyond blood or flesh. The old mind had broken through into something that shouldn't exist, and this creature had crawled up from depths that predated human understanding. It fed on life itself, on the spark that separated the living from the dead. And now it was choosing its final course. I threw myself between the creature and the family, driving my knife into what I hoped was something vital. The blade slid through alien flesh like it was made of wet clay, but the thing barely noticed. A casual swipe of one elongated limb sent me flying across the room. As I hit the wall, I saw helicopter rotors through the window. The cavalry had arrived, armed agents rappelling from aircraft, assault rifles ready. But they were still 30 seconds away. And 30 seconds was a lifetime when facing something that moved like liquid death. The creature reached for James with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment. The boy closed his eyes and waited for the end. I found my service pistol, forgotten in its holster. One round left in the chamber, my emergency backup that I'd carried for 23 years without ever needing to fire. I didn't aim for the creature. Instead, I put the barrel against the old gas line that fed the pump house's heater. The explosion knocked me unconscious and brought down half the building. But when I woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later, the family was alive. The official report listed the deaths as animal attacks, bear or mountain lion, evidence inconclusive due to fire damage. Dave, Lisa, Michael, and the 2 birdwatchers were buried with full honors. The mine was sealed with concrete and marked with radiation warnings to keep the curious away. But I know what's down there, waiting in the copper-scented dark. And sometimes late at night when the wind is right, I can still hear those wind chimes ringing in the abandoned fire tower, calling to something that should never have crawled up from the depths to walk among us. The forest is keeping score against us, and we're still losing. Cousin Reed owned this little off-grid cabin way out in the hills of eastern Kentucky, Appalachian country deep and tangled. It wasn't even marked on most GPS apps. If you wanted to find it, you needed someone like Reed to explain it using landmarks that didn't make sense until you were right on top of them. Take the gravel fork by the old cemetery, the one where the headstones lean at impossible angles and the names have been worn smooth by decades of mountain rain. If you pass the creek with the rusted-out bridge, you've gone too far. The bridge that locals say collapsed the night 3 children went missing back in '73. Their bodies never found despite the shallow water. He called me out of the blue one Sunday morning. Just said, "Hey man." His voice carried that familiar rasp, but there was something underneath it, a tension I'd never heard before. The kind that comes from spending too many nights alone in places where civilization is just a memory. I'm heading up to Ohio for a week. Gotta meet Heather's family. You doing anything? I wasn't. I just finished a temp job in Lexington and hadn't locked in anything else yet. The city had been wearing on me. The constant noise, the artificial lights that never let the darkness settle properly. Reed's offer felt like salvation. He asked if I could watch the place for a few days. Take care of the dogs, keep an eye on the propane, that kind of thing. It sounded like an easy break. No distractions, no work, just a quiet week in the woods where the only light came from stars older than human memory. I asked him what I needed to know. He listed a few things in that careful way people do when they're choosing their words deliberately. Feed the dogs twice a day. Benny gets the supplements for his joints. Rook gets double portions because he burns through calories like kindling. Make sure the propane didn't run out. The gauges are finicky, so check them twice. Check the generator occasionally. It's got quirks. Sometimes stops for no reason in the middle of the night. Then he said something odd, his voice dropping lower like he was afraid someone might overhear through the phone line. "Oh, and don't leave the gate open." "What gate?" I asked, thinking maybe there was livestock or something. The pause stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "You'll see," he said. Then he changed the subject to pickup times and spare keys. But I could hear something in his breathing, quick, shallow, like he was remembering something he'd rather forget. The drive there took close to 7 hours. The highways gave way to state routes, then county roads, then tracks that barely deserved the name. The last couple were through winding paths that got more and more narrow, like the hills were closing in on me with deliberate intent. Ancient trees leaned over the road, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out the afternoon sun. By the time I turned off the main road and hit gravel, I'd lost cell service, not just signal. I mean, it was like my phone forgot networks even existed. The GPS stopped refreshing, the little blue dot frozen in digital limbo, and it felt like I was slipping off the map entirely. The radio died too, leaving only the crunch of gravel under my tires and the whisper of wind through trees that had been growing since before the Civil War. Reed's cabin was nestled on a steep ridge, tucked under a canopy of old trees whose trunks were thick enough to hide a man. A narrow pull-off opened to a clearing, with just enough room for my car and what looked like the skeleton of an old pickup truck. It had no windows, no wheels, just a rusted-out frame leaning sideways like it had been dropped from a plane. Weeds grew through the wheel wells, and something had built a nest in what used to be the engine compartment. The place was dead quiet. No wind, no birdsong, no bugs buzzing, just a stillness that felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. Even the air seemed heavier here, thick with the smell of old leaves and something else. Something musty and organic that made the back of my throat itch. The dogs came down the porch steps as I got out. They were big, not in a scary way, but heavy-footed and serious-looking. Thick fur, white eyes that gave them this kind of ghostly stare that seemed to look through you rather than at you. One had a nicked ear and a patch of darker fur across his shoulder like an old burn scar. That one was Benny. The other, a little stockier with paws the size of dinner plates, was Rook. They didn't bark or growl, just stood there watching me with those pale eyes, then turned and padded back toward the porch like they were expecting me to follow. Their movement was strange, too coordinated, like they were responding to signals I couldn't hear. As I gathered my bags, I noticed they kept glancing toward the tree line, ears twitching at sounds that didn't exist. The cabin itself was cozy in the way only isolation can achieve, but clearly lived in by someone who didn't expect or want company. One big room with a fieldstone fireplace that looked like it had been built by hands that knew their craft, a worn couch that had molded itself to the shape of its owner, a little kitchenette with appliances that belonged to a different decade, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft with a mattress on the floor and windows that stared out into the endless dark of the forest. No Wi-Fi, no TV. A shortwave radio on the counter and a stack of battered paperbacks were the only nods to entertainment. The books were mostly westerns and horror novels, their spines cracked from multiple readings. One fell open when I touched it, revealing margin notes in Reed's careful handwriting. This happened to the Millers, and check the old logging trail. Reed had left a note by the sink with a few reminders written in his neat block letters. Dogs get fed at 7 and 6. Propane valves in the back, check them before bed. Lanterns charged, use them after dark instead of electric lights. Don't forget the back latch. At the bottom, in different ink like he'd added it later. Trust the dogs. If they won't go somewhere, neither should you. I tried the latch that first night and realized why he wrote that. One of the back doors didn't fully click shut unless you wedged a chair against it or really forced the bolt. The wood was warped from years of mountain weather, and the metal had a greenish patina that spoke of age and dampness. The cabin had 3 doors total, and everyone had a different kind of lock, like they'd been added at different times by different people with different fears. Front was a deadbolt, modern, sturdy, with scratches around the keyhole that suggested frequent use. Side door had a slide bar, old iron, the kind used in farmhouses a century ago. Back had the old twist latch that didn't align right anymore, its metal worn smooth by countless hands that had turned it in haste. The first 2 days were actually kind of great, despite the oddities. I hiked the trails behind the cabin, following deer paths that wound through trees older than the country itself. Sat out on the porch with a book while the dogs roamed the perimeter with purpose, always staying within sight but treating their patrol like serious business. Let them run free while I chopped some wood like I knew what I was doing. The rhythm of the axe helping me forget the strange silence that seemed to follow me everywhere. It was quiet in a way that modern life isn't anymore. The silence had weight to it, pressing down from the canopy above and rising up from the leaf-thick ground. Boring? Yeah, but the kind of boring that clears your head and makes you remember what your own thoughts sound like, without the constant background noise of civilization. At night, I'd light the oil lamps like Reed had suggested, their warm glow pushing back shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. The electricity worked fine, but there was something about the lamplight that felt safer, more honest. I'd settle in with a paperback or just sit by the fire, feeding it logs from the stack Reed had prepared. cut to perfect lengths and seasoned to burn clean and hot. The dogs would curl up by the door, but never fully relaxed. Even in sleep, their ears stayed alert, swiveling toward sounds I couldn't detect. Sometimes they'd lift their heads in perfect unison, stare at the same spot on the wall, then settle back down without explanation. I noticed the motion light out back would go off sometimes, just one bright flash lighting up the woods before fading out. The beam would catch the trees for a moment, turning them into stark black shapes against white light, then leave everything darker than before. I assumed it was deer, maybe raccoons, small animals looking for scraps or just passing through on their nightly rounds. The dogs never reacted to these lights. They'd lift their heads, maybe glance toward the window, then go back to sleep. But their stillness felt deliberate, like they were choosing not to react rather than simply unbothered. It wasn't until the third morning that something felt off. The trash bin had moved. I had left it beside the shed, wedged tight between a stack of firewood and the back wall where the wind couldn't get to it. The shed itself was solid construction, built from the same stone as the cabin's foundation, with a door that fitted so snugly it required real effort to close. But when I went out that morning, the bin was about 4 feet away from where I'd put it, still upright, still sealed with its heavy lid. No teeth marks or claw scratches, just moved. It wasn't light. The thing was one of those heavy-duty plastic ones with wheels, the kind designed to withstand mountain weather and determined wildlife. It hadn't rolled. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see clear impressions where it had been lifted and placed. I shrugged it off, told myself maybe the wind had caught it in just the right way, or maybe I'd misremembered where I'd left it. Memory plays tricks in places like this, where every day blends into the next and landmarks shift in the changing light. I dragged it back, jammed it tight against the shed again, and didn't think much more about it. But I started noticing other things. Small things. The porch chairs had been rearranged. Not dramatically, just turned a few degrees to face the tree line instead of the valley. The outdoor thermometer that read 72 when I checked it after lunch showed 48 by evening, though the air felt no cooler. When I tapped it, the needle jumped back to a normal reading. But I'd swear I saw frost forming on the glass for just a moment. During our usual walk before bed, Benny stopped dead on the trail about 50 yards from the cabin. No sound, just frozen, his body rigid as a pointer on scent. His ears went forward, tail down, muscles bunched like he was ready to either attack or run. Rook moved behind me, not barking, just making this low, almost inaudible growl that felt more like a warning to me than whatever he was looking at. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow light. Couldn't see anything beyond the usual tangle of branches and undergrowth, but I felt it like something was standing just outside the reach of the flashlight. Not watching, more like waiting, patient, calculating. The kind of predator that had learned human habits and found them predictable. The sensation raised every primitive instinct I didn't know I still had. My skin prickled with the certainty that we were being observed, studied, evaluated, that somewhere in that wall of black between the trees, eyes were taking our measure and finding us wanting. We stood there too long, none of us moving. The dog's behavior had shifted from alertness to something approaching fear, and that scared me more than the darkness. These weren't city dogs, soft and nervous. They'd grown up in these hills, knew what belonged and what didn't. If they were afraid, I should be terrified. Eventually, I just turned back, didn't say anything to the dogs, just walked back toward the cabin with measured steps, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. They followed without hesitation, but I could feel their attention fixed on whatever they'd sensed, their bodies tense until we were back inside with all 3 doors locked and deadbolted. That night I made sure every latch was secure, checked them twice, running my hands over the metal to confirm they were properly seated. The back door still didn't align perfectly, but I wedged the chair against it until the wood groaned under pressure. Then I brought both dogs into the main room, their presence a comfort against the isolation that suddenly felt less peaceful and more vulnerable. At 2:00 a.m., I woke up to the back motion light flickering on. I rolled over to check the clock, and something shifted in the window next to it. Not dramatic movement, just a shadow where there shouldn't be one. A shape that resolved itself into something that made my breath catch in my throat. There was a hand on the screen, pressing lightly against the mesh from outside. Long fingers with too many joints. Nails that had grown beyond any practical length. The skin looked rough, dry, maybe cracked like old leather. The hand moved slowly, deliberately, fingers flexing against the screen like it was feeling the texture, testing the strength, learning the barrier between inside and outside. I didn't move. My body had gone rigid with a fear so pure it bypassed thought entirely. The dogs didn't move either. They both sat up, ears flat against their heads, completely silent. No growling now, no warning sounds. Just absolute stillness, like making noise would invite attention they couldn't handle. The hand pulled back after what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I watched it disappear into the darkness beyond the light's reach, leaving only the memory of those two long fingers and the certainty that something had been cataloging the cabin's defenses. I stayed like that, frozen in place until dawn painted the windows gray. Only then did I feel safe enough to move, to breathe normally, to convince myself that what I'd seen was real, and not some nightmare brought on by isolation and too many horror novels. The next morning I checked everything, circled the cabin twice looking for footprints in the soft earth around the foundation. Found nothing, no depressions in the soil, no disturbed leaves, no signs that anything had approached the building during the night. The porch showed no evidence of visitors. The shed door was still tightly closed and locked. But the bedroom screen bore evidence I couldn't dismiss. A greasy, dark smear stretched across the mesh like someone had dragged charcoal or dried blood in a slow diagonal line. The stain had weight to it, substance, the kind of mark left by something organic and old. I touched it with a stick and it flaked away, but the smell lingered. Musty, organic, wrong. That day I found myself checking the locks compulsively. Every hour or so I'd do a circuit of the cabin, testing latches, examining windows, making sure every barrier between inside and outside remained intact. The dogs followed me on these rounds, their behavior more subdued than before. They no longer ranged far during their patrols, staying closer to the cabin, closer to me. The forest felt different too. Where before it had seemed simply isolated, now it felt actively watchful. I could sense attention from the tree line, a presence that tracked my movements without revealing itself. Every shadow might hide an observer. Every rustle of leaves might signal approach rather than wind. I tried calling Reed, but the landline was dead. Not surprising in a place where weather could take out communications for days at a time. My cell phone remained useless, its screen showing no service with the finality of a closed door. I was truly alone, cut off from the outside. World in a place where the outside world was beginning to feel like something I might never see again. That night I dragged a chair under the back doorknob and brought both dogs into the bedroom. Left the lantern on, its flame casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. Turned the radio to static just to fill the silence with something human-made, a barrier of white noise against whatever might be listening from outside. The dogs positioned themselves strategically, Benny by the window where the hand had appeared, Rook near the door. They weren't sleeping. They were standing guard, their pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like mirrors as they watched and waited. At 3:27 a.m., someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks, measured, not loud, but carrying the weight of absolute intention. Each impact resonated through the cabin's wooden frame, vibrating through the floorboards and into my bones. I stopped breathing. The dogs lifted their heads in perfect synchronization but didn't growl, didn't go to the door. They just stared in that direction with an intensity that spoke of recognition rather than surprise. Another set of knocks came, softer this time, almost gentle. Like whoever was outside had realized that violence wasn't necessary, that patience would serve better. The sound carried a terrible politeness, the kind of courtesy extended by something that knows it has all the time in the world. Then nothing. Silence stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibility and threat. I waited, counting heartbeats that seemed too loud in the quiet. 5 minutes passed, maybe more. My muscles cramped from holding the same position, but I didn't dare move, didn't dare make any sound that might indicate life within. Then I heard gravel crunch outside the window. More than one set of footsteps, soft and steady, circling the cabin with deliberate purpose. The sound moved clockwise around the building, pausing at each window, each door. Like visitors conducting an inspection, the footsteps were wrong somehow, too quiet for their apparent weight, too measured for anything human. That's when I heard the whispering. It wasn't words. It wasn't any language I could recognize. Just this layered, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. Clicks and throat noises woven together with something like humming run through a broken fan. One voice at first, low and guttural, then two voices harmonizing in ways that made my skin crawl, then more joining until the sound became this pulsing, disjointed chant that filled the air around the cabin. The whispers rose and fell in waves, building into crescendos that made the windows rattle before dropping to barely audible murmurs that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. The words, if they were words, carried meaning I couldn't grasp but felt in my bones. Ancient syllables that predated human language, sounds that belonged to things that had never been human. I sat there with my knees drawn up, one hand clamped on each dog's collar, feeling Benny tremble beneath my fingers. Rook had his hackles up, but neither of them moved, neither barked or whined. They understood something I was only beginning to grasp, that making noise, showing fear, responding in any way would be an invitation that couldn't be revoked. The chanting continued for what felt like hours, but might have been 10 minutes. Time had become elastic, measured not in clock ticks but in the rhythm of that alien chorus. The sound built to a fever pitch that made my teeth ache, then cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like death. But they weren't gone. I could sense them out there, waiting in the darkness beyond the motion lights, patient as predators who had learned that all prey eventually made mistakes. The air itself felt thick with their presence, heavy with the weight of ancient hunger and intelligence that operated by rules I couldn't comprehend. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the light to come back, clutching the dogs' collars like lifelines while something circled my sanctuary with the persistence of wolves and the intelligence of something far worse. Dawn came slowly, gray light seeping through windows that seemed smaller than they had the day before. When enough light had gathered for me to see clearly, I forced myself to move, to check the locks one more time, to peer out windows at a forest that looked no different in daylight, but felt forever changed. The motion lights had triggered multiple times. During the night, I'd seen the flashes through closed eyelids, but they'd revealed nothing, just empty spaces where something had been moments before. Whatever had surrounded the cabin moved faster than light could catch, or was smart enough to know when the sensors would activate. As soon as the sun came up, I packed, shoved everything in the car, whistled the dogs in, and drove without stopping to explain myself to Reed or refill the water tank. I just needed to be gone, needed to put distance between myself and whatever lived in those hills. The drive out felt like escape from a prison I hadn't known I was in. Every mile of gravel road, every twist away from the cabin, made it easier to breathe. The dogs sat in the back seat with unusual stillness, their pale eyes fixed on the rear window as if watching for pursuit that might follow us down the mountain. Halfway down the gravel road, I passed something that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. A trailer sat in a small clearing, though I swear it hadn't been there on the way in. How could I have missed it? The thing was ancient, its aluminum siding pitted with rust and age, windows dark as dead eyes, and out front stood a man, barefoot despite the morning chill, no shirt despite the mountain air that raised goosebumps on my arms. He stood with his arms hanging at his sides in a posture that somehow suggested both complete relaxation and coiled tension. He didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge my passing in any normal way. He just watched me roll past with eyes that tracked my movement with the precision of a hunter following prey. His expression never changed, not curious, not threatening, just attentive, like he was memorizing details for some future purpose. In the rear-view mirror, I saw him turn to follow my progress until the road curved and trees blocked the view. But even then, I could feel those eyes on me, patient and knowing, as if this wasn't the end but merely a postponement. When I finally got cell signal back, 3 hours down the mountain and well into civilization, I called Reed. My hands were still shaking, and it took 2 tries to dial his number correctly. He answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting by the phone. I told him everything: the moved trash can, the hand on the screen, the whispering chorus that had surrounded the cabin like a pack of wolves made of sound and shadow. He didn't laugh, didn't try to talk me down or suggest I'd been imagining things. He just went quiet for a long time, and I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Yeah, you saw them." His voice carried no surprise, just a kind of weary resignation that spoke of knowledge gained through experience rather than stories. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I was just the latest in a line of people who'd encountered whatever lived in those hills. They've been around for generations, he continued, his words careful and measured. Not people exactly, not animals either. Something in between. Something that stayed hidden unless you were alone. He paused, and I heard the sound of a door closing, like he was making sure no one could overhear, and even then, only if they thought you noticed them. I asked what they were, what they wanted, but Reed's answers were frustratingly vague. He spoke like someone who'd learned not to think too hard about certain subjects, who'd made peace with mysteries that had no comfortable solutions. Mountain people have always known about them, he said. Called them different names over the years, the Watchers, the Hill Folk, the Old Ones. Doesn't matter what you call them. They're older than us. Been here since before the first settlers came through the gaps. They don't knock unless they want something, he added, and something in his tone made my skin crawl. And if you knock back or answer, sometimes they take that as an invitation. Sometimes they decide you're worth keeping. I asked about the police, about authorities, about someone who might do something about creatures that terrorized isolated cabins. Reed let out this flat, humorless chuckle that held no amusement whatsoever. They don't come up here unless someone dies, he said. Even then, not at night. Too many search parties have gone missing over the years. Too many good men who went into those hills after dark and never came back out. The implication hung in the air between us. Law enforcement knew. They'd learned through hard experience that some places were better left alone after sunset, that some calls for help led to more victims rather than rescues. The old-timers, they have rules, Reed continued. Don't go into the deep woods alone. Don't answer knocks after midnight. Don't follow voices calling your name, and never ever try to photograph them or prove they exist. His voice dropped lower. They don't like being studied. They don't like evidence. I asked why he'd sent me there if he knew, if he'd always known what lived in those hills. The silence stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. I hoped maybe they'd moved on, he finally said. It's been quiet for months. No incidents, no sightings. I thought maybe the development down in the valley had pushed them deeper into the mountains. He sighed. I was wrong. They don't move on. They just wait. He told me about the trailer I'd seen on the way out, the man who'd watched me pass. That's Daniel, Reed said, and I could hear resignation in his voice. He used to be a ranger, worked these hills for 20 years. Good man, family man. Then he spent one too many nights alone up there, started seeing things, started talking about the Watchers like they were real. What happened to him? He started answering when they knocked. The words hit like ice water. I remembered the man's empty stare, his unnatural stillness, the way he'd tracked my movement without seeming fully human. They don't kill you, Reed explained. That would be too simple. They change you, make you into something between what you were and what they are. Daniel's not dead, but he's not alive either. Not in any way that matters. I asked about the trailer, about how Daniel survived up there. He doesn't need much anymore. They take care of their converts in their way. Feed them, shelter them, keep them functional enough to serve their purposes. Reed's voice carried a weight that spoke of personal knowledge. They use them as scouts, as watchers, as bait for people like you and me. The man I saw, I said, understanding dawning cold and sick in my stomach. He was watching for them, wasn't he? Reporting back about who comes and goes. Yeah, Reed said simply. And now they know about you. The implication hit like a physical blow. Whatever had surrounded the cabin that night, whatever had tested the locks and counted the barriers now knew my face, my scent, my patterns. I'd become a person of interest to things that didn't forget and didn't forgive. What do? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Stay in the city, Reed said immediately. Don't go camping alone, don't take jobs in isolated places, don't give them another chance to study you. He paused. And if you start hearing your name called from empty rooms, if you start getting knocks on your door after midnight, don't answer. Whatever you do, don't answer. I left that same day, drove straight back to Lexington without stopping. But Reed's warnings followed me like shadows, turning every creak in my apartment into potential threat, every unexpected knock into a test I couldn't afford to fail. 3 days later, Reed called to tell me he was selling the cabin. He'd found a buyer from out of state, someone who didn't know the local stories and wouldn't ask the right questions. The transaction would be completed quickly, quietly, with cash and minimal paperwork. What about the new owners? I asked, thinking about some unsuspecting family discovering what lived in those hills. Reed was quiet for a long moment. I left them the same note I left you, he finally said. After that, it's up to them to listen. But we both knew that most people wouldn't listen, wouldn't heed warnings that sounded like local superstition. They dismissed the stories as mountain folklore, convinced themselves that the isolation was peaceful rather than dangerous. They'd learned the truth the same way I had, too late to do anything but run. I never went back to eastern Kentucky, never even drove through that part of the state again, but the memory of those pale eyes watching from the darkness, of whispers in languages that predated human speech, stayed with me like a scar that never quite healed. For months afterward, I found myself checking locks obsessively, jumping at unexpected sounds, screening calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Every knock on my apartment door sent ice through my veins until I could verify it was the mailman, the neighbor, someone with a legitimate reason to be there. The dreams were worse. Night after night, I'd find myself back at the cabin, hearing that rhythmic chanting building outside the walls while something with 2 long fingers tested the barriers between inside and outside. I'd wake up in cold sweats, checking my windows for handprints that were never there but felt like they should be. 6 months later, I saw a news story that made my blood run cold. The family that had bought Reed's cabin, a young couple with 2 small children, had been found dead in their beds. No signs of struggle, no evidence of violence. Just 4 people who'd apparently died in their sleep from what the coroner called massive cardiac failure. But there were details that didn't make the official report. A local newspaper mentioned that neighbors had heard strange sounds coming from the property the night before the bodies were discovered. Sounds described as like singing, but not quite right. The sheriff's department had received multiple calls about lights moving through the trees around the cabin. But when deputies investigated, they found nothing. The cabin remained empty after that. No real estate company would list it. No local would buy it at any price. It sat in its clearing like a wound in the forest, slowly surrendering to the elements and whatever else might claim it. Reed moved to Florida 6 months after the sale, as far from the mountains as he could get. We exchanged a few emails, carefully avoiding mention of Kentucky or cabins or anything that might draw unwanted attention. He'd found work in Miami, he said, where the only forests were parks and the only darkness came from power outages that city crews rushed to repair. But even in our careful correspondence, I could read between the lines. He'd wake up some nights convinced he heard knocking, would catch himself studying the faces of strangers to see if they carried that empty, converted look. He'd moved his life to the most populated, well-lit corner of the country, but the mountains followed him in ways that distance couldn't cure. I tried to research what we'd encountered, spending hours in libraries and online, looking for historical accounts of similar phenomena. The search was frustrating. Most sources dismissed such stories as folklore, remnants of superstition from an unenlightened past. But occasionally I'd find hints of something real buried in academic papers or historical journals, references to non-human intelligence in Appalachian settlements, accounts of entire families found dead under mysterious circumstances, their cabins undisturbed but somehow changed, stories of settlers who ventured too deep into the mountains and returned speaking in whispers about the old ones who watch from the deep places. The Cherokee had stories too, warnings about beings that existed in the spaces between human and animal, between living and dead. They called them by names that translated roughly to the hungry shadows or those who take. The tribal elders had specific protocols for dealing with such entities, rituals of protection, rules of engagement, ways to avoid drawing their attention. But the settlers had dismissed these warnings as primitive superstition, had pushed deeper into the mountains with their usual confidence in human dominance over nature. They'd learned too late that some parts of the world operated by older rules, that intelligence took forms that human science couldn't categorize or control. The mountains themselves seemed designed to hide such things, valleys that didn't appear on any map, ridges that shifted position depending on how you approached them, caves that led to chambers older than human habitation, places where the normal laws of physics bent around something that had been there first and had no intention of leaving. I found references to government investigations, unofficial ones, conducted by agencies that didn't officially exist. Reports buried in classified archives spoke of biological anomalies and non-standard intelligence patterns in isolated mountain regions, recommendations for containment through isolation, and population management through discouraged settlement. The government knew, had always known. The reason certain areas remained undeveloped, certain valleys stayed empty despite prime real estate potential, wasn't always due to environmental concerns or geological instability. Sometimes it was because bureaucrats in windowless offices had read reports that made them quietly reroute highways and hiking trails, that made them ensure certain places stayed forgotten. But knowledge brought no comfort, only a deeper understanding of how vast and ancient the threat really was. These weren't isolated phenomena or random encounters. They were part of a larger ecosystem, a shadow world that existed parallel to human civilization, touching it only when necessary and withdrawing before detection became documentation. I started seeing signs of this shadow world everywhere once I knew what to look for. News stories about inexplicable disappearances in national parks, research stations in remote areas that closed suddenly due to budget constraints, hiking, trails that got rerouted for safety reasons that were never clearly explained. The most chilling discovery came in an old journal I found in a university archive, written by a geological surveyor in 1923. He'd been mapping mineral deposits in eastern Kentucky when he encountered what he described as a settlement of sorts, though not constructed by any people I know. His description matched what I'd experienced, the sense of being watched, the impossible sounds, the feeling that the forest itself had become hostile, but he'd made a mistake I'd avoided. He'd tried to document his findings, had attempted to photograph the inhabitants he'd glimpsed moving between the trees. The journal ended abruptly after that entry. The surveyor was found 3 days later by a search party, sitting by his campfire as if waiting for someone. He was alive but unresponsive, staring into the flames with eyes that showed no recognition of human speech or presence. He spent the rest of his life in an asylum, never speaking, never acknowledging the outside world, just sitting by whatever window faced the mountains and watching for something that never came. That's when I understood the true horror of what I'd encountered. It wasn't the immediate threat of death or violence. It was the knowledge that some forms of contact changed you fundamentally, that some experiences left marks that couldn't be healed or forgotten. The surveyor had seen too much, documented too much, and something had reached into his mind and removed the parts that made him human. I thought about Daniel, the former ranger in his trailer, and wondered if his transformation had been gradual or sudden. Had he fought the change, or had he welcomed it as relief from the terror of being hunted? At what point did the victim become complicit in their own conversion? These questions haunted me more than the memory of pale fingers on window screens. They suggested that survival wasn't just about escaping physical threat, but about maintaining the boundaries of self against something that could rewrite identity as easily as editing text. The real danger wasn't being killed. It was being changed into something that no longer cared about being human. Years have passed since that week in the mountains. I've built a good life in the city, surrounded myself with light and people and the comfortable illusions of civilization. But sometimes in the quiet moments before dawn, I find myself listening for sounds that don't belong to the urban landscape. And sometimes, late at night when the city sleeps and the electric lights dim, I think I hear my name called from empty rooms. I never answer. The mountains remember. And someday, when they decide I've been safe long enough, they'll call me back to collect what they consider theirs. The only question is whether I'll have the strength to keep refusing their invitation, or whether time and isolation will wear down my defenses until answering seems like the only logical choice. Until then, I live in the light and try not to think about the shadows that gather in the corners of my vision. Patient as predators, ancient as the hills they call home. The watchers are still out there, in the deep places where human maps end and older geographies begin. They're waiting for the next curious soul to venture too far from the safe paths, to spend too many nights alone in places where the darkness has weight and substance. They're very patient, and they never forget a face.